Hold on. Yeah, now why am I not? Oh, yeah, now I'm beginning. It's okay. Now it's coming to life. Okay, good.
Oh, there, no. Where's the one where you get all the, where you see all the?
Maybe it's over here.
I have to give you the high sign on.
Okay.
The recording has started. So there's no chips for the first two items.
Okay.
The discussion or the, there's three items altogether, or the reso. Oh, but there are two counting probably for the appeal.
Mm-hmm.
We are at the moment.
Now, when you say the first two items, I'm looking at
Well,
this.
no, first two hearing items. So,
Oh.
well, I mean, that's the first item. That's
Oh,
the
I can't.
discussion item.
Okay, got it.
And then the resolution of intentions on consent, so
Got it.
unless somebody
Got it.
pulls off, that's just setting the
Okay.
hearing date.
Got it. Okay, Commissioner McKinnon, are you ready to get started? Hey, Jason, how you doing? Good. I really enjoyed our meeting last week. Yeah. Okay. Good. Okay. Thanks for letting me know. Oh, that's it. Okay. Okay. So, yes, she is. Okay. Thank you for coming today. This is the Planning Commission meeting of October 17th, 2018. And Commissioner Sean, would you like to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Flag and place your right hand on your heart. Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice.
Okay. A roll call.
Commissioner Fresco,
Here.
Commissioner Landris,
Here.
Commissioner McKinnon,
Present.
Commissioner Perry,
Here.
Chair Fonda Bernardi.
Here. Okay, Director's Report.
Good evening, Commission. Next meeting after tonight will be November 7th. We'll have the 234 PICO project before you, Development Review Permit, which is actually on the site of the bowling alley on PICO. Also that evening, 2282 Santa Monica, which is a track map, and then a fence wall hedge modification appeal for 801 Ozone. Next meeting following that will be a special meeting on November 14th. That will not be here in the chamber, but will be at Virginia Avenue Park, and it will be the PICO zoning workshop number 2. On December 5th, we have the zoning ordinance next bucket and an update and presentation on water neutrality. And then on December 12th, again, a special meeting. That will be the City Arts Master Plan. Canceled the January 2nd meeting for obvious reasons. And then meeting on January 9th. And we're planning to bring the development review permit for an auto dealer project at 1802 Santa Monica Boulevard. Also wanted to let the Commission know that there was an appeal filed for 1921 Oceanfront Walk, which is a project next to Casa del Mar that the Commission saw a few weeks ago. Upcoming issues at City Council, November 13th, demolition interim zoning ordinance, and also an interim zoning ordinance to cover restaurants, fast food restaurants on the promenade. So this is in response to a City Council 13 item where they directed staff to look at an ordinance that would prevent the proliferation of fast food restaurants on the promenade. So that would be on November 13th. And then on November 27th, we're going with an item that will extend the parklet agreement for the parklets that are on Main Street. And we will also be letting the council know that in addition to extending the agreement, we will come back to them with a kind of a study session to share the results of the parklet program that we've had on Main Street for the last year or so. And that concludes my report.
Okay, are there any questions? Commissioner Landers?
Would you just repeat? Would you just repeat the date for the workshop in Virginia Park about the PICO plan?
Yeah, so that is November 14th.
November
Again, Virginia
14th.
Avenue Park, and it will be at 6:30. So it's a half hour earlier than your normal meeting.
Okay.
Thank you.
And that will be a commission-hosted meeting as part of our sort of bringing democracy to their doorsteps.
I just had a question brought to mind by the recent bicycle accident that was on 23rd Street. the city of Los Angeles, I believe, recently started noticing its residents about updates to the West Side plan, the West Side specific plan, and they've scheduled, I believe it held 2 out of 3 meetings, one related to the Del Rey area, one related to Venice, and there's an upcoming meeting related to West LA. I was just wondering to what extent, since that's our eastern and our southern border, to what extent we as the city of Santa Monica are in conversation with the city of Los Angeles, and what the process might look like to move maybe from communication to conversation, or maybe even some coordination.
Right. So I know our mobility staff is certainly aware of those meetings. I think they've attended some of them, but I'd like to get a further report from our mobility manager on exactly what coordination has happened so far, and then what options, what possibilities there are for further collaboration on that. So I'll get back to the commission on that.
Okay, any other questions?
So the other half of the hearing last time was the building on the corner of Pico and Ocean.
Sure.
That's not on the list. When's it likely to come back? I mean,
Yeah.
I have some concern that when we continue something, that not be 4 months later, that it
Right.
be kind of within memory.
Yeah, no, we are working
Particularly
with
my
them.
memory these days. You
Sure.
know.
No, we're definitely working with them on the changes that they're making. There's been a lot of coordination. We just don't have an exact date yet, so that's why I didn't announce anything. Yeah, it could be within the next couple months, Jing. Yeah, yes, but it won't drag out for 4 months, as you said.
Okay, no further questions. Okay, any announcements from planning commissioners? Okay, hearing none. We're going to go into the items on the agenda, 8A, and we'll start with the seismic retrofit report.
Thank you, Kyle. Good evening, Chair, Commissioners. My name is Ariel Sakaris with Building and Safety. It's a pleasure to be before the Commission again. It's been a while since I've last seen you all. I'm here to provide you an update on the seismic retrofit ordinance. It was the last update that Building and Safety gave to the Planning Commission, coincidentally, was a year ago, almost to the day. It was October 18th of 2017 that Building and Safety last provided the update. So in terms of this presentation, I will still be going over background of the ordinance and the process of the ordinance, primarily for the benefit of the new commissioner. Welcome to the commission, as well as to any members of the public that may be interested in the information, and to provide a refresher for the rest of the commission, because there's nothing wrong with refreshing your memory with this sort of information. So just real briefly, some background on the ordinance. It was adopted by council in March of 2017. We had anticipated beginning the official noticing and distribution of the orders to property owners a few months after that in May. However, during that time, we started to receive inquiries from property owners and claims that prior retrofit work had been done on their properties, and that they shouldn't be subject to the ordinance because the work essentially had already been done. We started to look into those claims deeper and got information from some of these property owners and verified that in fact they were correct. Some of these properties should not have been on the list. So we decided to postpone the noticing to August of 2017 to provide for some time to further refine the list and improve its integrity. And what we did was created an administrative process called what we call the request for reconsideration process. And it was a simple application that the property owner can fill out. It's essentially just general contact information and a formal submittal of a request, and any other documentation that they might have to help us in making our determination, whether it be approved plans for a prior retrofit, structural calculations for retrofit work, or the best case scenario, a final inspection approval for prior retrofit work. So that was put in place, and as I mentioned, the official noticing didn't begin until August 14th of 2017. In the table you see on this slide, the five different building types affected by the ordinance are identified. You have concrete tilt-ups, unreinforced masonry buildings, soft stories, non-ductile concrete, as well as steel moment frames. You can see that there was just under 2,000 affected properties that were originally on the list. Since the implementation of the request for reconsideration process, we've removed over 200 properties. It should be noted that these 200 weren't removed just between May and August of 2017. We ended up retaining the request for reconsideration process and still have it today should a property owner feel that they have enough information to have their property removed from the list. And what I forgot to mention also as part of that process is once we do get that submittal from the property owner, our staff also does additional research within Laserfiche and permit records to see if we can supplement what the property owner has given us. So as of today, the number of properties on the list is just over 1,700. And you can see the breakdown there. Soft story making up the large majority. It's over 80% of the overall number of buildings. So quickly, just to go over the process, a notice or an official order is issued to a property owner from the building officer. There is an appeal period, a 60-day appeal period, where the property owner could appeal the issuance of the order. And real quickly, just going back to the request for reconsideration process, that administrative improvement was important as well because it helped eliminate the need for having to go through unnecessary appeals, because otherwise the only remedy that these property owners would have had was to file a formal appeal, and then we'd have to go to the Fire Life Safety Commission with these now 200 plus properties that should not have been on the list to begin with. But nevertheless, we haven't received any appeals to date. So after the property owner is noticed, they have the option, I should say, of submitting a structural analysis report to show, prepared by a licensed engineer, to show the state of the building and to identify or to provide a determination on whether or not retrofit work is required on the property. Building and safety staff reviews the structural report to see whether or not we are in agreement with the findings of the report and whether or not a retrofit work needs to be made. There is then a second appeal period based on the building officer's determination of the structural analysis report, and that is also a 60-day appeal period. So assuming that retrofit work does need to be done, the process moves into the entitle and permitting stages. If there's any ARB that needs to be secured or any landmarks issues that may need to be addressed due to the status of the building, those would need to be addressed beforehand, and then plans could be submitted for plan review through the regular building permit process. And as part of that process, of course, given soft stories and the large number of soft story buildings, which are typically apartment buildings, any tenant occupied properties also must comply with the tenant protection and tenant relocation requirements of the municipal code, including provision of means and methods of construction to show whether or not habitability of these units will be affected. Once permits are issued, construction, of course, commences, and then the work is completed. So this schedule here is the noticing schedule of the dates for when the notices went out. The different building types are on the left. You can see that soft story was broken down into further subcategories due to the volume of affected buildings, and to spread it out so that the due dates would not all fall together in one line, and we would get an increased volume of submittals all at one time. But as I mentioned, the notices began being sent out on August 14th of 2017. And at the bottom, you can see that most recently, the final set of notices were mailed out on August 6th of 2018. So the noticing phase of the retrofit ordinance has concluded. We're now moving into the evaluation report phase. And The initial due dates that have approached are the due dates for structural reports for concrete tilt-ups and unreinforced masonry buildings. These due dates passed in November and December of 2017. So any property owners that have not submitted a report by then, which includes now, would be violating the seismic ordinance. And as I will mention in a follow-up slide as well, we are working with code enforcement to actively monitor and enforce those violations. The soonest deadline for completion of retrofit is August of 2019 and August of 2020, again for the tilt-ups and the unreinforced masonry buildings. So we will, of course, be actively monitoring those dates once they approach. And the most recent date for compliance with structural reports for soft stories isn't until September of 2019, so there's still some time for property owners to work on that. This table here is a lot of numbers, just basically demonstrating compliance with different deadlines. Again, the building types are on the left-hand column, the number of notices that were sent out per building type. You can see the number of structural reports that have been submitted to date, and the number of cases closed, which is, I believe, is 241, if I remember the math that I did earlier today. And cases closed could include properties that have gone through this request for reconsideration process, or it could include projects that have been completed. And then moving on to cases that have been forwarded to code enforcement. As I mentioned, the only deadlines that have passed have been for tilt-ups and unreinforced masonry. So there are 29 total cases that code enforcement currently has that they are working on. And we have 86 plan check submittals that have been received to date, and 27 permits issued, and only 4 retrofits as of today have actually been completed and finalized. So to talk about some administrative actions that we have taken on. As I mentioned, we implemented the request for reconsideration process, which significantly aided in the efficiency of the process for buildings that should not have been on the list. We also implemented a simplified soft story plan check process. Again, soft stories are a large majority of the affected properties, and just the general nature of a soft story, it is the building type that has the least invasive type of retrofit work that's going to affect the property, and as such, it lent itself to a less intense or a simplified plan check process, so that we could move those plan reviews along quicker. What we did was we integrated a pre-screen checklist into the application form. There are 3 divisions that need to review soft story plan reviews. It's building and safety, planning, as well as mobility. Building and safety, of course, will be included in all the soft story reviews because they need to see that and review the plans for compliance. However, there was some flexibility to potentially eliminate planning and mobility from plan check review if the responses to these questions in each of these columns is no. For example, in planning, the questions are asking if the retrofit work is visible from the street or introduces new materials or colors, leaning towards ARB and design requirements. There's also a question about whether or not more than 25% of the exterior facade or wall elements are being removed. And that also lends itself to the demo definition and HRI properties. Elimination of parking stalls, as well as is there any other work outside the scope of the retrofit project that is being proposed. And that's an important question, because even in building and safety's processing of these, if a plan check comes in and it includes scope that goes beyond what is needed just for the retrofit work, it would not get the benefits of this simplified process or the pre-screen. It would be reviewed and looked at just as any other permit. And for mobility, as you can imagine, the questions are based primarily on are you reducing space dimensions, vertical clearances, driveway widths, or eliminating or reducing the hazardous visual obstruction. So also in talking about means and methods, because again, soft stories being mostly apartment buildings and potentially tenant occupied, rather than requiring the contractor or the applicant to fill out what is now a 4-page means and methods plan form. It's fairly extensive and requires a lot of detailed information in terms of, again, the means and the methods of how construction's occurring, the days, the hours, are utilities going to be shut off. So again, in an effort to simplify this process for soft stories, we are simply asking that the contractor or the permit holder sign this acknowledgement form, acknowledging that they understand the requirements of the tenant protection and tenant relocation ordinance, that they recognize the construction hours authorized by code, that they will not be affecting the habitability of any tenant occupied units. And this again helps simplify the processing of their application. Now, it doesn't preclude the city's ability, should construction start and end up being more invasive or more excessive than originally anticipated, the city could pause the construction and ask the contractor to come back in and provide a more detailed means and methods. Additionally, even during the plan review process, the building and safety plan checkers are aware that even during their review of soft story plans, if they think that it shouldn't qualify for this acknowledgement and additional means and methods information should be requested, that we can look at that as part of plan review and not just wait until after the fact and after the permit's been issued. So moving on to the third bullet, we have entered into contracts with outside firms to assist with structural report review and plan check reviews when workload volumes increase. We have upwards of 1,700 affected properties, so at some point, it hasn't gotten there yet, but we do anticipate that volumes will increase significantly, and these contracts are in place and ready for when we do reach that point to assist building and safety staff with these reviews. Also, there were 3 community meetings held. We had a general meeting in on November 13th, 2017. And when I say general, it means it was general in scope for retrofits. It was to cover all building types. It didn't focus on any one building type. And it included city staff, of course, as well as CIOSC, Structural Engineers Association of Southern California, who assisted the city in the development of the ordinance and has been very active in assisting and helping the city implement its ordinance. They're a nonprofit. They provide public assistance in terms of finding contractors, finding engineers, making sure that they're reputable, and just helping direct people through the process. In addition to providing information, handouts, and things of that nature that could help designers potentially with their design of not just retrofits, but anything related to engineering. There were an additional 2 meetings on March 8th and August 22nd of this year. Those 2 meetings were focused specifically for soft stories. They were strategically scheduled shortly after groups or batches of some of the soft story notices had gone out. So we included that notification with the orders, and hopefully it gave the owners more incentive to come should they have questions. It was in the same general format, but it was just more specifically related information to soft story and the city ordinance. And lastly, we, even though CIOSC did help us implement and to write and implement the ordinance, we are still in touch with them regularly, and they are continually providing discussions with us and brainstorming in terms of how to improve things. Our recent meeting last week, we just talked about some of the experience they had. They are engaging us as well to see what the issues are, what the problems are, if any, so that they can also share with other cities. And one of the valuable things I think that especially that we got out of the last meeting is they share good examples of what other cities are doing. So, for example, they provided some good examples of informational handouts that some other agencies are providing. So we're working on preparing some of our own and updating our website to make sure that that information gets out to the public and assists them through this process. So with that, that concludes my update on where things stand now, and I'm available for any questions.
Okay, any questions?
I was just a little unclear. You said that you have 241 cases closed, but you also said that you had about 200 cases that were already kind of taken care of by previous improvements that owners had done. So does that mean only about 40 people actually have improved their things in the last year? I didn't understand the numbers.
Correct, yeah. The 241 are properties that were either, yes, because only 4 retrofits have been completed. So
okay.
up until now, there hasn't been. I mean, we're still so early on in the life of the ordinance that only 27 permits have been issued as of today. So yes, the majority of the cases closed are a result of the request for reconsideration process.
It seems odd, but I swear I feel like I've walked past several of them. They must just all be in my neighborhood. All right, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, Commissioner Waters.
Just had a couple of questions. One is with respect to means and methods and habitation and displacement. It's slightly outside the purview of this commission, but is anyone monitoring the risk of displacement? I assume that many of these units are in rent-controlled properties. There are protections in place, but of course there are others as well. But is there any monitoring of the risk of tenant displacement beyond the retrofit itself?
Beyond the retrofit, you mean out in projects that don't include retrofit?
No. I mean beyond the term of the retrofit. In other words, making sure that people are only temporarily displaced from their units, that this is not an excuse for other economic behavior leading to displacement, permanent displacement of people.
Yes, definitely. A couple of years ago, I think it's been about 2 years ago, the city hired a neighborhood preservation coordinator.
Right.
And her primary role is monitoring and assisting the tenants through that process should it affect them. Code enforcement is also heavily involved, and then, as I mentioned, during the plan review process, building and safety is the key reviewer in terms of the quality of the means and methods plan and whether or not it needs to be bolstered or dates change. And then should construction go beyond the anticipated time frame of what the contractors provided in the means and methods plan, that is a recent improvement as well that has been put in place by the neighborhood preservation coordinator, where we are now tracking these. The tracking is automated in our permit system now with a field that includes the dates, so we get notified when those dates pass, and we can then require that the means and methods plan get updated to make sure that it reflects current timeframes.
Okay, and then on the sort of the other side of that, if we can pull up the slide with the dates and the requirements, just in terms of how it's going. This is obviously a huge process, and we are not the only city in LA County or Southern California that's dealing with it. What are you hearing from property owners with respect to their ability to actually contract with someone to get this work done for a fair price?
At the community meetings, the major issues that we heard the most were the fact that the city was forcing them, of course, or mandating them to do this work. We have heard from some property owners that it's difficult to find contractors for a variety of reasons. I can't speak to the validity of the claims. I mean, it goes so far as to they'll say contractors just don't want to do work in the city, so they can't find people. So that's a sort of extreme scenario.
I'm really talking about the demand, the fact that there's a there's a spike in demand for seismic retrofitting work, and that someone who legitimately wants to get the work done, you know, are there enough contractors, are there enough qualified structural engineers to come out, to do the report, to do the work by the deadline? I don't know the answer. I'm just concerned that we're creating sort of a market bubble that we may in a couple of years turn around and say we're struggling to get it done.
Yeah, we've heard the same concerns,
Okay.
and from the city standpoint, it's hard to say because we aren't involved in that search process, but we haven't noticed anything yet.
Good.
But we have heard the same concerns, and yes, given that we have, LA, West Hollywood, and I think Culver City has their own retrofit ordinance as well, it could be a problem given the number of buildings that need to be retrofit.
Okay. And then lastly, are you anticipating contracting for, you're going to have a huge code compliance workload as these deadlines pass, and maybe not the staff to assist with that? You're planning for that as well?
We've discussed it.
Okay.
Nothing yet, but we're definitely aware of it and planning ahead for it.
Thank you.
Jason?
Yeah, with the tenant relocation question, the temporary relocation, does the city play a role in sharing best practices or any other information with property owners that help minimize the impacts on tenants?
They need to be aware. I mean, as property owners, it is in the means and methods plan. So first and foremost, the applicant or the contractor is acting on behalf of the property owner, so they should be aware, and they are included in the notification process. So they're aware of the content of the plan. In terms of getting them involved in or informed of the best practices, nothing that explicit, other than just informing them of what's in the plan and what's been approved and what the contractor's obligations are.
And is that an approach that other communities have taken, where they try to assist the process in some way with information that may help expedite the project and reduce the impact on tenants?
I haven't really looked too much into what other cities are doing with their tenant protection ordinances. Unfortunately, the neighborhood preservation coordinator isn't here, and so I can't speak to what other agencies are doing in that respect.
Okay. And I'm curious, what was attendance like at these community meetings?
Attendance at the first meeting, I wasn't at the first one. Chris, do you recall roughly?
I'd say Commissioner, I believe about 250.
So at the initial meeting, which was again general in scope, we estimate about 250. At the soft story meetings, there was probably about 70 at the first, and I'd say about 40 to 50 at the second, at least.
And then for those properties that are now non-compliant because they did not submit the evaluation report, what's the process that code compliance takes in reaching out to those property owners?
Well, what we did was we sent out first, Building and Safety sent out a courtesy notice a few months even after the deadline had passed, informing them that they had 30 days to comply or the case would be forwarded over to code enforcement. It was then forwarded over to code enforcement, and they have also been working on, of course, many other cases and have not reacted to it immediately. So there has been some more time provided for the property owners, but they're actively notifying the property owners and working towards compliance.
And if a property owner responded and essentially asked for more time, does it then just maintain as a code compliance case until the evaluation report is received and other requirements are met?
Correct. Yeah, whenever a code enforcement case is opened, it will remain open and monitored by the officer until it has been resolved and then closed, which in this case would be submitting the evaluation report.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. I have a lot of questions, as usual. First of all, thank you for bringing us this report. You and I have talked to in the past about trying to accelerate the time frame because we really are racing the clock and we're behind. Could you go back to the slide that shows all of the numbers there? Yeah, that one there. So if I'm reading this one correctly, it looks like we start out with, like, take the first row there, concrete tilt up, we have 31 cases, and only 8 have been submitted, meaning about a quarter of the people have responded with an evaluation. Is that an accurate? And those guys were, and 8 more were in code enforcement. So about a quarter people respond and a quarter people slide across the deadline and get themselves into trouble. Is that an accurate kind of assessment of where we are?
It is only for the cases forwarded to code enforcement. It should be noticed, I don't recall if I mentioned in the presentation or not, but that step where the structural evaluation report is required, that's an optional step for the property owner. They can just fully commit to doing the retrofit and not have to spend the money hiring an engineer and preparing the structural report if they know right off the bat that they're going to need to do the retrofit anyways. So the 8 reports submitted may not be, it wouldn't be a fair statement to say that those are the only ones that are in compliance at this point.
Okay, but it does seem that we're as Commissioner Launders suggested, we're rapidly going into enforcement mode, which is always more expensive and more time consuming than anyone would ever imagine to run herd on. If at the end of this job where a quarter of our people are not in compliance, that would be 400 cases of code enforcement. Do we have the staff for that? Do we have the muscle for that, so to speak? Because it's not a pretty picture when a quarter of your people are sitting on their hands, maybe with good reason, but still, that's not a good thing. So do we have, maybe the city attorney wants to speak to this? Or
yeah. Well, I would say no, we really don't have the staff and code enforcement to handle that kind of non-compliance. If that were to occur, and we had, like you were describing, the 400 cases that they were faced with, we would have to look at that and look at other priorities and figure out how best to respond to that. So that's something that we would handle if that were in fact to happen.
Okay. Well, then let me ask a few other questions. I liked your little checklist that tells you whether you're going to planning, whether you're going to mobility, whether you're going to ARB or landmarks. When you get there, for example, when you get to mobility, and funny thing, you have to shrink a parking space. Is that something you can do by right within certain limits, or do you have to apply for a minor modification? In other words, I'm asking for ways to speed up the process here.
No, the ordinance has baked in some flexibility to either reduce the number of parking spaces or minimize the parking dimensions to the least extent possible. So that's an option that's afforded to be exercised administratively. It would not require a minor modification.
Okay. And who makes that determination? Is that something the building department plan checker does, or is that something the planning department plan checker does, or the mobility department, let's say?
It would fall under the authority of the director of planning and community development, which mobility is a division within.
I see. Because I'm trying to cut more and more hands off of this thing. It should, in my mind, the building department should run this thing through within certain guidelines and not bother anything else, because we're trying to speed it up. So, or let me turn it around the other way. If you had power and you were God over this whole process, what would you do to speed it up? Knowing what you know, we've had 1 year of struggling with it. What's the learning curve on reducing the time?
Well, I think what we've done has been helpful already. We've targeted the building type with the most number of units, and we've simplified the plan check process to move it along more quickly. Our plan reviewers are also aware that these are high priority projects and the timelines are slightly reduced. It isn't anything significant, but they are given a slight higher priority than other plan checks. But other than that, within our administrative authority, there is, we have constantly, or at least not constantly, but we've had a number of discussions of how to do this within our administrative rights, and this is where we are at now with the request for reconsideration process, which is again dropped off 220 projects that appeal cases that we didn't need to hear, and then now the 1,600 soft stories that have this more efficient process through plan check.
Okay, so for example, how many of your projects in the plan check process have gone to ARB? Because theoretically you need ARB before you can start your actual building permit processing. That would, in my mind, would be a big delay. And where are we in that?
Well, given the scope of most, if not all, the soft story projects, that level of ARB approval would likely be staff level. So I don't know if Jean wants to speak to this, but staff level approvals could typically occur in one day.
Yeah, so the way that we handle the seismic retrofit plan checks, they are assigned to really only 2 planners in the entire division. So it's a very focused review, and we worked very closely in developing that checklist actually to make sure that we're filtering out as much as we can. But the vast majority of them, I can't think of any that have required board approval because of the nature of the seismic retrofit for soft story. It's usually the tuck under parking at the back.
Right.
Like it really has no effect whatsoever there. So the planners are directed to what we do. We actually don't initiate a staff approval application. It's actually just folded into the plan review. So it's just part of the plan check, and it's authorized right then and there. So we're not having the person come in and bring in extra information.
Okay, well that's good to hear. Now the other thing is in the beginning part of this, the request for reconsideration and the structural analysis report. Are there fees for that?
No.
No, so you only start paying fees when you actually get your building permit, or you're starting to get your plan check for your building permit. Is that correct?
Correct. When you submit the permit application for plan review is when the fees start.
Okay. Now, apart from the code requirement that projects that are landmarked or in a historic district, they get expediting approval. Is there anything in our processing that is moving faster than the seismo retrofit plan check?
Only the projects that by code are obligated to have high priority, which, as you mentioned, are landmarks or 100% affordable housing projects.
Okay. So, and we feel with this outside plan checkers, they are going to help us make it about as fast as you can. What would you say the turnaround time is once it leaves your desk? It's going out to some plan checker that we've hired. So how fast do they turn them around?
Well, we haven't utilized the outside consultants yet because the volume hasn't reached that level yet. We've secured the contracts in anticipation of that increased workload. But similarly to what planning is doing, we only assign retrofit reviews to 2 plan check reviewers. So again, there's a level of consistency and familiarity that also helps turn things around quicker. I would say typically a soft story retrofit.
I can state that when we had an RFP going out for the consultant, the condition was to have a 2 weeks turnaround time.
Okay. I think that would be a significant improvement because our normal turnaround time is about 6 weeks. So if we can actually get it down to 2 weeks, that would be good.
That is, I apologize, if any technical questions that may come up related to engineering or structural, our building official is here. That's
Okay.
Chris Lee.
So, okay. Last question. We're in a process that looks like it's going to take somewhere between 2 and 20 years for all of our buildings. And maybe this is a question for Mr. Lee. During that 20-year period, certainly the structural codes will change and be probably updated. Certainly in that window, we will probably have a large earthquake somewhere in California. There'll be a steep learning curve. Are we comfortable with our 75% of the loads required for today, given what may happen in the future?
Like Ariel mentioned, we are having constant meeting with CIAC members, and we anticipate, based on what we learned from now to in the future. We anticipating coming back to the council, first going through a 5 Light Safety Committee and taking recommendation of CIAC's and other structural association members' recommendation, and having close communication with the City of LA, maintaining very similar requirement amongst the cities in West LA County. So we will be making updated as time goes, especially on moment frame non-ductile concrete.
Okay, great. Any other questions?
In looking at your chart, it appears that the last moment for refit is 20 years away, 2037.
That is correct.
So the consensus appears to be that there's a 99.7% chance of a 6.7, 6.8 quake in LA during that time. Isn't that time frame a little far out for the safety of the people in Santa Monica?
It is.
And in general, across the board, despite your problems, aren't all of these time frames a little far out to protect the people inside the buildings?
Well, the 20-year time frame only applies to one building type, and it's the steel moment frame, which affects 77 buildings. And I agree, 20 years is far out. And again, coming from the layman's perspective of not being an engineer, I do know that steel moment frames are the most complex of the group, which was part of the reason why they needed that larger time frame. The others all fall within 2, 3, 6, and 10 years.
Well, 10 years is quite a long time. But let me go back to the 20-year time frame. You mean it's going to take 20 years for each of those buildings to be retrofitted? Surely it only takes a couple of months. It might take a while to prepare. I mean, it just seems like a very long period of time.
If I explain the reason why we went 20 years, I believe, on moment frame buildings, it's typically a high-rise building with a fully occupied with the tenants. And we're the only cities in, I believe, Southern California mandating those buildings to be retrofitted. And we had a numerous discussion with the CIAC members. There's a really, you spend so much money into retrofitting a certain type of building, benefit coming back from retrofitting those buildings, it kind of sometimes outweighs, the financial aspect of big factors in categorizing.
So can I characterise what you're saying is that the rate of return for the owner is not sufficiently high enough to protect the people in the building?
Well, let's say, let me explain about the 20 years.
I think that says yes.
Again, because it is typically a high-rise and fully occupied, and the way the retrofit can be done, you cannot possibly evacuate and relocate every tenant at one time. And because the building usually has a tenant with a long-term lease, when it's vacant, we anticipate every time someone vacates one floor, they can move in as before they do a full tenant improvement construction. They can touch on those moment frame joint and do a proper welding for a retrofit. So that was kind of a.
So would you be happy to work in one of those buildings, say in 20 years, as the possibility gets higher that the earthquake will strike? I think no. So that's the problem that we've got. I understand what you're presenting to me as the timeframes that are given, but I think there's an essential weakness in this program, which is it's not proceeding fast enough.
One thing I can add as well is when we did provide the update to council, this question did come up as well on the steel moment frame buildings. So the question is do we want to amend the ordinance to reduce those timeframes? But just as an FYI, this question, I should say, did also come up by one of the council members during the update presented to them.
So my analysis of what you presented this evening is incredibly comprehensive program you've put together. A lot of checks and balances. You're tracking it incredibly well. The timeframes are not strong enough to protect the people who are living or working here. And it doesn't really matter whether or not other cities aren't doing it. As we've seen, there was a big discussion about San Francisco recently, and I think there are question marks over their building program. We ought to be taking a lead here, and I understand there are financial obligations or questions about them. But that, what you've presented this evening raises questions in my mind about the program of protection going forward. Thank you.
Okay.
Just have one last question. I'm related to this because I am concerned about it, and I'm concerned about I am concerned about the equation that I think we just heard in terms of return on investment versus risk versus life and protection. I'm also concerned, and this might be a question for the city attorney. I was reading the other day about some very archaic insurance laws coming back to bite people. And I'm concerned that we are not suggesting to anyone that their liability or their insurability is affected by these dates, because I think one of the things that is extremely important, given the complexity of earthquake insurance, I'm not trying to delve into that. If we are going to communicate the urgency of this work, it ought also to be done in a way that makes clear to everyone who's a stakeholder in this that this has to get done, and that we're not letting anyone, we're not letting ourselves off the hook as a city, but we're not letting property owners off the hook from the work, and we're not putting residents at risk. So I just, given that when I see these dates, I start to worry about giving people the impression that they can take their time.
So I think I'll try to start, and if staff wants to jump in, they're welcome to. I'm not an earthquake insurance expert myself, but I do know that when this ordinance was developed, a lot of careful and lengthy discussion did occur amongst staff and the city attorney's office, primarily, and code enforcement, to try to balance all the various interests you have heard this evening related to property owners, the users of the property, safety issues, and kind of realistic timeframes to ensure that every single property in the city was accounted for.
And I would just add to what the city attorney said. It's, there were a lot of considerations when this ordinance was established and went to city council, and ideally, buildings would be retrofitted as quickly as possible. But looking at the various things that needed to be balanced, this was the ordinance that was adopted by council, and now staff is in the process of implementing that ordinance. So, we're not in a position to revisit the timelines. We are moving forward based on the ordinance that we have in effect.
So the timelines are locked into the ordinance?
Yes.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, thank you for your very comprehensive report. And let's go to any discussion. Any comments from, there's no chits from the public, so we'll move right into discussion. You're all struck the first time. This group has not had a word to say, so we will take full advantage of that and just say, go as fast as you can. Okay, and we'll close the discussion, and now we'll move on to our next item. And let's start with ex parte communications. Oh wait, we're at the zoning ordinance, sorry. So the zoning ordinance is an ROI, which is some intent to discuss it.
Chair,
it's
can I
on
just,
consent, so
may I note
yeah,
that
if you want
there
to make
is a revised Exhibit A to the resolution of intention that's been handed on the dais and is also by Kyle for members of the public. And it's just a very minor change to limitation 21.
If we're treating this as a consent item, then I'll move the consent calendar.
Second.
Okay, any discussion? Hearing none?
Oh, I have a question.
I have a.
Go ahead.
As I ask for each time we vote on these resolutions of intentions, when we have our discussion, just to kind of help us track this incredibly lengthy, long-term, ever fluctuating process, can we also have a list of the outstanding items on our list that are yet to be discussed, that just not for discussion when we have our discussion of these items, but just so that we can remember what's coming up down the road and continue to
Tony is keeper of that list, and
Tony,
certainly we can provide
help
that
us,
to you.
please. Thank you. That's all. Thank you.
Okay.
And I just wanted to, it was a question regarding process, that our resolution of intent doesn't actually indicate that we've taken a position on any single one of these, simply that we intend to take them up. Is that
Right.
correct?
This is just to start the process to be able to discuss them. Yeah.
Okay. No further discussion. Can we take a vote? We can do it by acclamation. Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, any opposed? Any abstentions? Good. Okay. Let's move on to 11:30. And let's see, are there any ex parte communications? Let's start at that end.
I can do mine in the meantime. Should I do mine in
yeah,
the meantime? Sure.
right.
Okay. I have an ex parte to report. I met with Gabrielle De Benedictis and John Caswell at 11:30 Pearl on October 14th from 2:55 to 3:15 or so. We viewed the items under consideration and discussed neighborhood context and definitions and the presence of other non-conforming structures, hedges, and trees.
Commissioner Fresco?
I also met with the appellant at the site on a day. I'm sorry, I can't seem to find the day in my calendar. I'll get back to you. Sorry.
I met the
Commissioner
appellant at the subject site, 11:30 Pearl, October the 15th at 11 o'clock in the morning. We spoke and walked around the property for approximately 1 hour, examined both the hedges, walked up and down the street, looked at them from various angles, and that was that.
Okay. Commissioner Perry?
Yeah, I met with the appellant on October 11th at the site from 1 p.m. to 1:20. We examined and discussed the side yard hedge, the rear yard hedge, the hedges on nearby properties, and the co-treatment of hedges.
Okay, and I visited the site today around 5:30. So can we start staff report?
Yes.
Oh wait, Commissioner Fresco, did you find your date?
October 10th at 10:30 a.m.
Great, thank you. Okay, please.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Ross Furman with the City Planning Division. The request before you tonight is an appeal of the zoning administrator's partial approval of fence wall and hedge height modification at 1130 Pearl Street. The subject property is located in the R1 single unit residential zone district, specifically in the Sunset Park area mid-block between 11th and Euclid Street. At approximately 6,000 square feet in area, the property is consistent with the size and dimensions of the surrounding properties. Here is both an aerial and bird's eye view of the property. The property is currently developed with a one-story single unit dwelling constructed in 1950. It is important to note that this particular section of Pearl Street slopes up towards Euclid Street and only begins to start leveling out after the subject property. Each of the orange lines on this map present contour lines that increase by 2 feet. The elevation change of the subject block starts at an approximate elevation of 102 feet at 11th Street and does not start to level out until 2 parcels east of the subject property at approximately 144 feet in elevation. This upward slope has resulted in this block having an approximate grade differential of 42 feet and parcels at higher elevations as development moves up Pearl Street to the east. The subject property, through the combination of this elevation change and development of adjacent parcels, is approximately 6 feet lower in elevation than the adjacent property to the east. The property to the south, abutting the rear property line, is of similar elevation as the subject property. The appellant is appealing the zoning administrator's partial approval of a fence wall hedge height modification to allow a 15-foot high hedge within the east side setback and a 12-foot high hedge within the rear setback, where maximum heights of 12 feet are allowed. The applicant's original request was to allow a 20-foot high hedge within the east side setback and a 30-foot high hedge within the rear setback. Here are both pictures of the subject hedges, both the east side hedge and the rear hedge. And here's a site plan of the property identifying the location of both the existing side and rear hedges. The red dashed line identifies the 25-foot front setback line. As a key finding for approval is the compatibility of the proposed height modification to the surrounding neighborhood. This map shows that of the 23 properties located on this subject block of Pearl Street, there are only 3 registered or modified fences, walls, or hedges, which are represented as the green shaded parcels. The 2 green shaded parcels outlined in red identify properties that have received registrations similar to today's request. Specifically, they refer an 8-foot 2-inch wall and a 10 to 20-foot hedge, both within the side setback areas. The 8 parcels shaded in orange identify properties that have existing non-conforming fences, walls, or hedges. These vary from 15 feet to 30 feet, and the majority are either in the side and rear. However, without property access, some are difficult to fully assess. While there are examples of both registered and non-registered overheight hedges, the general context of this block of Pearl Street is that of conforming heights. Here is the street context along the south side of Pearl Street. As you can see by these pictures and on the ones on the following slide, the 2 top pictures illustrate the slope of the street, with the bottom picture showing the street leveling out after the subject property. The subject property is located in the middle picture, right in the middle of the elevation. And here is the north side. Here are some specific examples of non-conforming fences, walls, or hedges within the project vicinity. In order to approve the proposed request, the following findings must be made. The hedge must be compatible with other similar structures in the neighborhood and is necessary to mitigate surrounding impacts. The hedge must not be detrimental or injurious to the property or improvements within the vicinity, and the hedge must not impair the integrity and character of the neighborhood. After considering all the evidence and public testimony presented at the hearing, the zoning administrator partially approved the fence wall and hedge height modification by denying the request for a 30-foot high hedge within the rear setback and approving the east side setback hedge at a height of 15 feet instead of the requested 20. For the rear hedge, the zoning administrator was unable to make the required findings in regards to the hedge being compatible with the surrounding neighborhood, that the request would not have a negative impact on the integrity and character of the neighborhood, or that surrounding land uses warranted a height modification. In regards to the east side setback hedge height modification, the zoning administrator found that due to the grade differential between the subject property and the property to the east, the height modification of 15 feet would be appropriate to provide additional privacy while still keeping within the neighborhood context. In the filing of their appeal, the appellant brought up the following issues for consideration to warrant the reversal of the zoning administrator's decision. The first one is privacy. The foremost reason stated by the appellant for the height modification is the desire for privacy due to the existing upslope of Pearl Street and the grade differential that was further exacerbated through the redevelopment of the neighboring properties. The approximate 6-foot plus grade differential between the subject property and the property at the higher elevation to the east is largely the reason the zoning administrator approved the east side hedge modification of 15 feet. This height was based off the site context and and legally registered or modified heights in the immediate vicinity. However, no grade differential exists between the subject property and the adjacent property to the south abutting the rear property line, nor is there an established precedent for legal overheight rear hedges within the property's immediate vicinity along Pearl Street. Therefore, there are no circumstances that warranted the height modification within the rear setback that relate to the required findings. It should be noted that privacy itself is not a key consideration in regards to the required findings that need to be made in order to approve this request, and is only really taken into consideration in association with such factors as safety, proximity to the public right-of-way, and impacts from adjacent land uses. The second one is surrounding neighborhood context. The Santa Monica Municipal Code does not define a neighborhood geographic area. However, it has been the zoning administrator's standard practice for fence wall and hedge height modifications to review both sides of the street for the block on which the subject property seeking the modification is located. While the applicant states that analyzing only the subject block of Pearl Street does not give a holistic view of the neighborhood, the single block is used because surrounding land uses, setback distances, topography, and character can vary greatly from one block to the next, let alone different areas of the city. The definition of hedge was called into question. Per the Santa Monica Municipal Code, a hedge is defined as a boundary or barrier of plant material formed by a row or series of shrubs, bushes, trees, or other similar vegetation that enclose, divide, or protect an area, or that prevent a person from passing between any combination of individual shrubs, bushes, trees, or other similar vegetation. While the subject hedge may be separate plantings, their close proximity and lack of maintenance have allowed their canopies to grow into each other, making them a solid barrier, which classifies them as a hedge per the definition. While the applicant has the option to trim or prune the hedges to become separate trees that have no height limit, it is claimed that that would potentially kill the remaining ficuses. And lastly is environmental advantages. The appellant lists that the existing hedges benefits to the environment and urban forest. However, it is important to note that environmental consideration is not part of the required findings for such a request. Therefore, while the hedges may or may not be a benefit to the environment, this has no relevance to the request approval. As per usual, notices were mailed to the surrounding property owners and tenants within a 750-foot radius of the subject property, and the request was advertised in the Santa Monica Daily Press. 5 letters have been received. 3 letters are in support stating the hedge's benefits to privacy and the environment. 1 letter was from the neighboring property to the east at the higher elevation, supporting the side hedge, but at a 15-foot height instead of 20. And the last letter is from the appellant's certified arborist, testifying to the potential health risks to the rear hedges if trimmed down to the permitted 12 feet, and the benefit to the city's urban forest and environment. In conclusion, staff recommends that the Planning Commission deny the appeal and uphold the decision of the zoning administrator to partially approve the fence wall and hedge height modification 17 ENT 0213. That concludes my presentation. I'm here to answer any of your questions.
Okay. Any questions?
Go ahead. Okay. I just had a couple of, one is a procedural question since we're only 5. How many votes are required for us to take action of any kind? 4?
4. Yep.
4, 6, right, exactly. 4. Okay. Just so I understand. And then I guess I have a question about the definition of hedge. Since one can walk around these individual ficus trees, I guess if you could help us understand how you arrived at, this is just on the rear side, on the rear, how you arrived at the definition. Are you saying that it's a hedge above that area?
That is correct. So I understand that the trunks have some separation, but above the trunks, the canopies have grown together, which have now created that solid barrier.
Okay. And then as far as the nature of enclosing, dividing, or protecting the area, are you because there is that fence that defines the property line, Are you relying on that aspect of the definition, or primarily the definition that they are a totally dense barrier above, essentially above ground?
I believe it's the dense barrier above the ground. Are you talking about the white fence in that picture
Yeah.
as well? That is a permitted height. You're allowed to go up to 8 feet for
Right.
that, so that is allowed. It's when the hedges now have exceeded 12 feet and also formed a barrier that has been the issue.
Right. No, I'm because there are hedges that actually form form a property line, create an enclosure, actually do that, and I'm trying to understand your position as to whether or not those 4 trees actually constitute an enclosure or barrier, a divider or protector.
Per the definition, we do believe that it constitutes as a hedge, those 4 trees.
Thank you.
Commissioner Perry.
Yeah, I do have a question that I would like to ask now, so that I can help process some of what we're going to hear from the appellant. You, if I understood correctly, you described that one of our findings is that the hedge height would be necessary in order to address impacts from adjacent land uses. But you also said that it's not that privacy doesn't enter into the analysis. Is that because your interpretation of impacts excludes privacy concerns?
I think when privacy was taken into consideration, it was largely based off of the surrounding land uses. So the property to the east being higher was a surrounding land use that warranted some level of mitigation, which is why the zoning administrator found it appropriate to allow for some of the height modification up to 15 feet. As in reference to the rear hedge, we were not able to find any or make any of the findings based off of either surrounding land uses or other registrations in the area. So privacy itself is not always taken into consideration, but sometimes it can be grouped in based off of surrounding land uses.
Got it. Thank you.
Commissioner McKinnon.
You stated that 11 of the 23 properties in Pearl Street have some sort of fence hedge modification, some legal, some non-legal. But you also stated that you weren't able to gain access to a lot of the properties.
Mm-hmm.
My observation is that many more have non-conforming to the zoning code modifications. It's just that you weren't able to get access to those properties.
That might be true.
So at least half of them, 11 of 23 and 49%, on your observation and our records already are modified, and there are more. We just can't verify that.
Well, I think there's a difference. So there's only 3 that are legally modified. All the orange ones you see that I believe that I saw were non-conforming technically are illegal. They have exceeded the height limits that are permitted, so they largely shouldn't be taken into consideration because they are non-conforming.
So have they all now been cited as part of a program?
Yes, actually after the zoning administrator's hearing, I myself reported all the ones that I was able to identify to code compliance, and I believe the applicant might have added to that list.
So does that mean the people next door have been cited?
Yes, the one to the east?
Yeah, so they actually have a citation in their hands and a compliance case. All of these people have compliance cases open at the moment.
I believe so. So I turned all the addresses in. I know there's a code compliance case open. I'm unable to see the progress of those cases as those are.
So we don't actually know that.
I don't know what state they are in, but I know
we know what
case
we know
happening.
what you did.
Yes.
Okay, so in the zoning code, it says that a side hedge will be 12 feet high. How many times do we have a circumstance where the grade is altered so substantially so that there's a 6-foot differential to start with? So if there's a 12-foot hedge, that's really the equivalent of a 6-foot. How often does that happen?
I'm not sure if I can give you the number as far as how many parcels have been redeveloped to result in this type of grade differential.
We don't know. And the reason this is relevant is we had at the last Planning Commission hearing an issue where there was sloping land, and the sloping land led to a modification and a variation because the zoning code, which we all drew up, well, a couple of us drew up, was predicated fundamentally on flat land. And yet here's an alteration which automatically renders the hedge less viable than it would have been on flat land. Does that get taken into account?
I think that's largely why the zoning administrator allowed for some height modification.
Can I ask you something? You don't really know that, so you're speculating, right?
I mean, when findings were drafted...
I think the answer is yes, you are speculating.
So I think Ross is answering correctly, that in the sense where there is a grade differential, I mean, that was part of the consideration in terms of why greater than a 12-foot hedge was accommodated. Basically, why a 15-foot hedge, so that effectively, from the midpoint between 6 feet, you'd have 12 feet on the upper side, and you have 15 feet on the lower side. So, certainly in those situations, it is something that we take into consideration. Okay. And just to clarify, you are the zoning administrator we refer to in this document, right? That is correct. Excellent. You wear a lot of hats. Okay, so those are my questions at the moment, but there'll be more later on. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions for staff? Okay, hearing none. Oh. Please.
I do have a follow-up from Commissioner Perry's question. I understand that privacy is the limited applicability as a consideration toward the findings. I'm wondering whether there are other considerations of impact from adjacent land use, such as, for example, light pollution or light in general. Is that technically something that can be considered or not?
I think as you look at the required findings, and I think you're referring to finding number 1.
Yeah.
Really it's a two-step test. One, the first part is there a compatibility with the neighborhood? So that's the first part. And the second part is that whether the modified fence wall or hedge is required to mitigate impacts from adjacent land uses, the subject's property's proximity to public rights-of-way or safety concerns. When we've looked at adjacent land uses where you have a residential, there's, I think, less credence given to where, for example, if something were to be, backing up on like Lincoln Boulevard or something like that, or, you're next to a really busy roadway, those are the sorts of things we think about. In a residential neighborhood, the character is very much different. These are sort of normal, typical, people living their lives going on. So it's not something that we really look at in terms of light pollution or what have you, unless it's a commercial residential interface. Then there's certainly more weight given to that.
Okay, I guess one of the what I'm trying to understand, and it strikes me that this body and the council did some work last year related to mansionization, and we're going to come back with the permanent R1 next year. And I'm asking in part because I think there is a question that arises as to what happens when a property changes in the immediately adjacent to a subject property, and whether or not we are allowed to consider the prior, say, the prior light patterns or the prior noise patterns that might distinguish a one-story house from a two-story house, because or a larger home with a closer setback relative to a smaller one. It's a question of what we're allowed to consider.
Yeah, I mean, at this moment in time, no. I mean, the R1 code does not speak specifically to that kind of a consideration. That is why we have side and rear yard setbacks, is provide that appropriate space, within a residential area.
Okay, are there any other questions? I have a code clarification question relating to the neighbor next door. When you have a 6-foot retaining wall along that property line, presumably, the person who might build a railing or a wall on top of that 6-foot retaining wall, would they be allowed to build they'd be allowed to build a 6-foot high wall, right? Because the total height would be 12 feet measured from the lower property in this case.
So a fence or wall within that area is only allowed to have 8 feet. Only a hedge is allowed to have 12.
Okay. So they could only get a railing on top of their wall of 3.5 feet on top of their 6-foot wall, so they would be potentially 9.5 feet.
In that case, because of building and safety code, they could allow
Got it.
for a railing.
Okay, thank you. Okay, no other questions? I think we can hear from the appellant.
And the thing is where? Oh, here. Can I point it where? But I point it here or anywhere? Okay, I don't have to point. Okay, thanks. All right, good evening. Thank you all for coming to visit my site. I really do appreciate your dedication and conscientiousness. My name is Gabrielle De Benedictis, and I've lived at 1130 Pearl Street for almost 40 years, since 1980. And my appeal is actually 2 appeals. All of you that came to visit know that. So I'm going to start with, this is taking time to load. The reason we're looking at all of this is we want to look at the letter and the spirit of this hedge fence code. So the spirit of it, in my understanding, is to promote an open, uncluttered look for residential streets that allows for a high degree of social interaction, and it is to avoid enclosed compounds or fortresses which wall off neighborhoods, create uninviting routes for pedestrians, and impair the integrity and character of the neighborhood. So the spirit of the law is really what I want to focus on. You all know the letter of the law. So I don't know why this is doing this here, but okay. My thing is not working. So I'm going to start with my side setback issue, which was what was complained about. My rear hedge was not complained about. So the complainant is the owner of 1204 Pearl Street, which is the uphill property from me, and this is the new house that was built in 2006. As you can see, I've labeled it the Fortress because it's walled off from the street with the frontage shrouded by tall vegetation. So really not in the spirit of the code. Here's my property. It was built in 1950, and it's open to the street and inviting to pedestrians. So I've labeled it the Moat because I'm so much lower than his property. I figured that was appropriate. This diagram depicts the change in elevation between my home and the homes around me after the 2006 construction drastically altered the natural slope of the hillside and altered my living conditions. So on the left, you see pre-2006 that at the boundary lines there was I'm at 1130 Pearl, so between the house above me and the house below me at the boundary lines, there was about a 2-foot elevation difference. When the house at 1204 Pearl was under construction, they raised the ground level by approximately 5 feet and then built a 2-story house on top of that. So now the elevation change between my ground level and their ground level is 7 feet. This grade change is not found anywhere else in my neighborhood, so it's unique in the neighborhood, and that's because of them changing the hillside. Here are some photographic evidence of the same thing I've just shown you. So on the right is pre the 2006 construction, and on the left is post. And you can see at the bottom in red shows the elevation change before the new construction and after the new construction. You can see on the right-hand side that the ground level of the house at 1204 Pearl is 7 feet above my ground level, and my roof line is only at 10 feet. So my roof line is only 3 feet above the ground level, which is why I needed to plant that hedge. Here shows the same historical difference now from my back of my property. So you're looking on the right at my garage, and if you were facing on the left is my garage. And if you're looking out towards my garage, you'd be looking out towards Pearl Street. So you can see before 2006, I had an open view of the sky, and the roof of 1204 Pearl Street was hardly even visible. And after construction, you can see there's a 12-foot fence there that is in violation that belongs to 1204 Pearl. And you can see their 2-story house looming above mine. I put in complaints to code enforcement about the violations of 1204 Pearl at the end of 2006, which is approaching the end of their construction, and then again at the beginning of 2007. The first complaint was about the soil line being raised 12 to 18 inches from the top of their 8-foot retaining wall, and there were cracks along the wall, so I was concerned about that. And code enforcement pushed it along to building and safety. They didn't do anything about it. Code enforcement was also notified of the 12-foot fence that was in violation, and the code officer said he was unable to verify in his report, but however, to me, he told me that he wouldn't be able to make them take down the fence because there was a cliff between me and 1204 Pearl. So these inactions resulted in the problems being kicked down the road by a full decade. And today, there are still at least 3 violations at 1204 Pearl. They have been opened by code enforcement, but 1204 Pearl's owners have refused to let them access the property, so nothing has been done for over 8 months now. It was interesting to me that they won't let the code enforcement officers on the property, but they felt free to publicly comment about my violations tonight. Here you see, again, 1204 Pearl Street, and on the right you see my hedges below their second-story balcony. On the other side of their house, at 1208 Pearl, there's a hedge identical to mine in material. It's above the roof line of 1204 Pearl, and it's well over 20 feet tall. And then again, on the right, you see how much lower my hedge is. I think that there's a complete inadequacy and inequity of the hedge code on an extreme slope. And the ground level difference between the contested parcels is not due to the natural grade of the slope, but to 2006 alteration, which only benefits 1204 Pearl Street. This artificial grade change drastically stripped my home of light, air, and privacy, as well as subjected its residents to heretofore unparalleled light and noise pollution. It victimized the 27-year residents in favor of this new development. This grade differential is unique on the block and triggered the need for greater screening height than would be adequate on ground level. So here, the diagrammatic is hard to see, but that larger rectangle is their 2-story house. The small square is my 1-story house, and there's sight lines. It's very hard to see. There's some lines that show to the left a 15-foot hedge, and the sight line that still is reaching my home, and then a 20-foot hedge, and the sight line goes out past my home. And then on the right-hand side of the square, which represents my house, shows a 12-foot hedge that would be 2 foot above the roof line if we were on level ground. So here is the red arrow is pointing to the balcony of 1204's master bedroom. They have an unobstructed view of my living area. The hedge that was contested is to the left of that. You can see a 15-foot hedge would be well below their balcony, which is why I'm asking for a 20-foot hedge, because I don't see why they should have an unobstructed view of my whole living area from every window in their house. The ground level changes have radical consequences. The original ground level was drastically altered and completely out of character with the neighborhood. The complainant was not required to request a fence height modification in 2007. This was injurious to my property and triggered the necessity for a hedge of adequate height to shield the bedrooms and garden from unwanted viewers. All that I ask for now is treatment equivalent to a home on level ground. If you add the difference in ground level, which is approximately 7 feet, to the 12-foot allowable hedge height, you get approximately 19 feet, and I would be very happy to cut my hedges to that height. It's a couple feet lower than they be now. I have 25 neighbors who signed a petition in support of my hedge appeal, and you can see where they are in relation to that teardrop on the map. It's mostly everyone on my block, and then on either side, on Cedar and Pacific. My next issue is with my rear setback. These are 4 mature ficus trees, and I'm going to point out here, my trees are not a hedge by city definition. They do not enclose or divide the area. The 4 trees end about 30 feet from the boundary of my property, which is 50 feet wide. So as Matt Wells said when he looked at my trees, why would you build half a wall? They don't enclose the property. They only go not even halfway across my property. They do not prevent a person from passing between them. One can easily walk between and around each of the tree trunks. So they're not a hedge in my opinion. The ficus trees were planted in between existing eucalyptus trees about 4 decades ago. You can see the eucalyptus trees on the left-hand side there. That was 27 years before the hedge codes were applied and as long before the city defined a hedge. 10 years later, by 1990, the ficus trees had been in situ for 1 decade. I think proof that they were here before the ordinance should allow for consideration of registration now. My trees are in keeping with the neighborhood. You can see here, my trees are in orange on either side there, and then next door in green, same height as mine. On the other side, same thing. The neighbor on the other side has also multiple trees. Same idea. These are other rear setback hedges on Pearl Street that are above 20 feet, almost 30 feet. So 1123 Pearl has one. 1108 Pearl has one. These all, by the way, all predate the hedge codes. You can tell by the kind of vegetation, they don't grow that quickly. Here's another one at 1114 Pearl. You can see it from my backyard. Here's a side setback hedge, so like the one that was complained about originally. And again, from my backyard, you can see the two-story house is about the same height as it. So that's about 30 feet high over there. This is the chart that Ross had made. I added to it, so the green highlighting was not in the staff report. The red circles represent overheight hedges. There are 23 houses on my block of Pearl Street. 9 of the 23 have non-conforming rear hedges. 7 of the 23 have non-conforming side hedges. 2 of the 23 have non-conforming front hedges. For a total of 18 non-conforming hedges on 23 houses, there are about 2 out of 3 of the houses that have a non-conforming hedge. Only one of the hedges is registered. The other registrations that Ross was referring to were for fences or walls. So I think the city did a poor job in communicating the need for registering hedges between 2005 and 2007, judging from this street alone. Why not allow me to register the trees now? My trees have never been managed as a hedge, as you can see from the complete lack of suckering and uncontrolled growth. The large limbs have been pruned to retain a branching form with a spreading crown. And because they are trees, it never occurred to me to register them as a hedge in the grandfathering process. You can today make an exception for them or let me register them. I had 27 neighbors who signed a petition in support of keeping my mature ficus trees at the rear boundary, and they're all local neighbors. Actually every certified arborist I spoke to said that my trees were trees and not a hedge. This is Cy Carlberg, who made a written report. She said the 4 subject trees present as trees and are treated and managed as trees. Pruning them to 12 feet in height is not an arboricultural industry approved procedure and could affect their long-term health and vitality. The severe cutting of trees is in direct conflict with the city's urban forest master plan, arboricultural best practices, and is, in my professional opinion, ill-advised. So what I'm asking for in my trees are any of the following. 1, accepting that they are trees and not a hedge by definition. 2, granting an exception to the code due to the character of the neighborhood. 3, allowing me to register the trees now because of proof that they predate the code by decades. 4, put a hold on cutting the trees to code until such time as the task forces complete drafts for private property tree protection ordinances, which they are working on now. Or 5, anything else you can think of to save my mature trees. In speaking with Matt Wells and going to a talk of his, he mentioned that Santa Monica has lost 15 to 19% of its urban canopy. Of this loss, 21.5% was from single-family residences. So enforcing a 12-foot hedge code on healthy mature trees will only exacerbate the loss of canopy. I'm asking you, please, can't we put a hold on killing until an ordinance like Pasadena's to protect trees on private property is drafted? The city's master plan promotes creating a maximally functional urban forest by increasing both current total canopy coverage and total biomass. My 4 trees comprise about 30,000 cubic feet of biomass, but cutting them to 12 feet would destroy 20,000 cubic feet of that. We need protection of these trees on private property. The Santa Monica task forces are working on this now. Can we put a hold on destroying the trees until the ordinance is drafted? I'm sure all of you are aware of the United Nations report on climate change. We have just 12 years to make massive and unprecedented changes to limit global warming to moderate levels while our momentum pushes us in the wrong direction. The carbon sequestered in my 4 ficus trees has taken 40 years to store, but it will be released back into the atmosphere during the decay process in a few weeks or months once the trees are cut down to code. Have we mistaken the accelerator for the brakes? Okay. This is on quality of life here. My trees improve our environment. They remove carbon. They cool the surrounding area. They absorb and filter stormwater. They lower energy costs for nearby buildings and increase their value by 7 to 19%. My trees are part of the web that sustains us. They provide a quiet, shady, cool place to be out of public view. They offer habitat for birds and other wildlife. Just being in their presence has been shown to relieve stress and reduce heart rate. In deep ecology, they say you don't have to tell someone not to cut off their own arm. Once we recognize that these trees are an integral part of what sustains us, it should be obvious that their fate is entwined with our own. Thank you. Any questions?
Okay, any questions for the appellant?
Do we have a request to speak on this?
Yes,
okay,
that'll
so
come up
I'll
next.
hold my question.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So we have 2 requests to speak. Yeah, you get to rebut at the end. Let's start with first speaker, Jerry Rubin, followed by Sarah Bayer. And you have 3 minutes.
Thank you very, very much, Chair Bernardi, Commissioner, City staff. My name is Jerry Rubin, Santa Monica resident, representing a small organization, tree-loving group called Tree Hugging Friends. And we support the granting of this appeal. And I do understand the need for regulations, but here it calls for your attention to find ways to accommodate this. I've seen many exemptions from your bodies, City Council and everything on many issues. We're not talking about getting rid of the regulations. There's many exemptions that you can grant, many hardship cases, many logical reasons that were presented just now for you to reach out in that way to accommodate that these trees not be ruined. I'm looking at Cy Carlberg's report. 4 weeping fig trees, appropriately named that because of the jeopardy that they might be in. Now, your previous item on seismic retrofitting, you gave some people 20 years, which is a truly safety issue. This is not. The issue of privacy is tied hand in hand with safety. People have concerns. You don't have to be exactly as every house to be a conforming property. This does conform with the neighborhood. It might not be exactly uniform with every other property, but why would Santa Monica ever want that? It conforms in so many beautiful ways. And I think every neighborhood understands that. So you have an obligation. Should environmental issues be taken into consideration? If not, why not? And why aren't they, even at least indirectly, in consideration? And they should be in the not too distant future. Should these be grandparented in? Of course they should. It wouldn't open up a floodgate. But they deserve to be. They didn't know trees were supposed to be considered hedges. There's an easy way to let this happen. And it would be so unfair. So someone that has lived there and taken care of these trees, and they're not a safety threat to any wires or anything else, that one resident can make a complaint and have this go to this point would be totally unfair and un-Santa Monica.
Thank you. Okay, Sarah Bayer, please.
Hi, my name is Sarah Bayer. I'm a resident in Santa Monica, 801 Ozone Street. You'll probably hear from me next month on my appeal. And I just want to clarify for Gabriel that no one complained on her ficus trees. And I just want to bring to your attention a couple articles. One is, and excuse my little voice. I don't know what happened. Anyway, Mayor Winter commits Santa Monica to Paris Climate Accord. This was in the Mirror last month. Let me put my glasses on. Cities are critical actors in the global response to climate change, especially when it comes to infrastructure investments that must be made towards making the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. Santa Monica Mayor Ted Winter demonstrated Santa Monica's commitment to meeting these requirements last week at the Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco when he signed onto the deadline 2020, a roadmap for cities committed to delivering on the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement. Then in quotes it says, the decarbonization of the global economy is in sight. Transformational changes are happening across the world and across all sectors as a result of technological innovation. Then I want to take you to Santa Monica Urban Forest. Sprint out. About the urban forest, environmental benefits of street trees. Next to its people, trees are arguably the most important resource in Santa Monica. Our trees work for us day and night, year-round, continually improving our environment and quality of life. Santa Monica's forest provides environmental benefits in the form of improved air quality, reduced energy costs, reduced storm water runoff, sequestered carbon in their woody mass, shaded streets. Trees are an essential tool for removing carbon from the air. It is in their trunks, branches, leaves, and roots while releasing oxygen. Planting trees remains one of the cheapest, most effective means of drawing excess carbon from the atmosphere. A single mature tree can absorb carbon dioxide at a rate of 48 pounds a year and release enough oxygen back into the atmosphere to support 2 human beings. Trees remove gaseous pollutants and particulate matter from the air by absorbing them with normal air components through their leaf surface. And it goes on, and just from Edison, I get the energy report. They want us all to be energy conscious, and I think trees help reduce air conditioning. They provide shade.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Sarah? Okay.
Please grandfather in Gabriel's trees, since they're very beneficial.
We heard you. The appellant, would you like to make any closing comments?
Good evening. I am John Caswell, and I reside at 1130 Pearl Street. I just returned to Santa Monica this September when I retired from the city of Sacramento. As you've seen in the earlier slide presentation, I was here enjoying my hammock in the 1990s and continued to do so until I had to leave for Sacramento in 2001. I made many trips back to Santa Monica during those 17 years and saw the construction of the enormous residence at 1204 grow ever taller and closer to our small house. After its completion, I had to move my bed from the wall and the window that faced 1204 to get away from the lights and sound of their water heater, air conditioner, and water sprinklers. Sadly, my view of the rising moon and the sun daily were blocked by their house. I thank the commissioners who visited the property and saw for themselves the natural slope of the hill and the abrupt and artificial change in the ground level that was created by the occupant of 1204 in order to add height to his property and his second floor sightlines. There's no other such ground level change on this block of Pearl Street. The trees that make up the hedge between 1130 and 1204 have provided us with some privacy, but it still feels like we're being watched from guard towers. Even their chihuahua is at my eye level when it barks at me while I am in the bathroom. Those who visited also saw that there are other trees and hedges of similar height on this block, including a hedge of podocarpus just 50 feet away on the opposite side of 1204. When I was living in Sacramento, I would look forward to taking time off and return to my beloved hammock where I could escape either the extreme heat of the summers or the wet, cold winters and enjoy the pleasant qualities of the Santa Monica environment. I would usually fly down on Thursday mornings, take the Big Blue bus from LAX and head to Pearl Street. All my coworkers knew that I was headed to the hammock. So I would taunt them by taking short videos of me swinging under the ficus trees and sending them to them back when I knew they were working. Please do not destroy these trees and mess with one of the pleasures of my retirement. I just got back. They have always been there. They have always been trees as long as I have known them, and that goes back to the 1980s. The commissioners who visited also were able to see the other trees and hedges that are adjacent to the rear setback with the 4 ficus trees. Those trees, even if they are unregistered, cannot be unseen. They are the same heights, shape, and characteristics as ours. In Ovid's Metamorphosis, Daphne's father, who was a river god, turns Daphne into a laurel tree at her request to help her escape the advances of Apollo. These 4 fig trees cannot be turned into a hedge by a civil servant interpreting a poorly worded definition in a zoning ordinance. Thank you.
Okay, any questions or comments? Okay, Commissioner Fresco. Okay, so Commissioner Perry.
Yeah, I have questions of the appellant.
Please.
Hi.
Hi.
Did I understand correctly that one of the issues, if coming out of this meeting, you are required to trim down the ficus trees along the rear property line? Do I understand correctly that how that's done and over what period of time it's done is significant to the viability of those trees?
Certainly how it's done is significant to the viability of the trees. How it's done and would you say, and how long
over what period of time
it's
done?
Well, depending on what, I mean, if it was to take it down to 12 feet, I don't think it would matter what period of time. The trees would be unviable. They would be stumps at 12 feet. It would depend on what level you're taking them down to. A tree trimmed properly is trimmed at the branching elements, which makes it different from a hedge, which is just cut. So when you cut a hedge, it doesn't have to be at the branching element, and that's why you get uncontrolled growth, which makes a dense barrier. Okay, a tree is trimmed at branching points is going to be more open. So if it was trimmed properly by an arborist, you could probably take it down. I'm not an arborist. I had to consult with a certified arborist, but you could take it down to some level and still have it be viable. I think that Ms. Fresco, when she was visiting, suggested that you could take out the 2 center trees and that the other 2 would fill in. And when I asked my certified arborist about that, she tended to disagree because ficus trees are very susceptible to sunburn. And she said that taking out the 2 center trees would leave the other trees now that had been shaded now exposed to the sun, and that would be detrimental to them. She suggested it was not a good option.
Okay.
So if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Would you be able to bring up that hand-drawn diagram that you presented earlier that showed the sight lines?
Sure. I'm sorry I didn't. I mean, I felt pressured for time, so I didn't.
No, I also want to comment on how much information was a part of your report. Thank you for informing us so well.
I'm a teacher, and I apologize for rushing through it. I'd rather be able to express myself better, but it didn't have enough time. So here's the sight lines, and if I can do this, I can point out. This thing is just, I don't know how to work this at all. I can see it there, and I can't see it.
It's over here now.
I don't see it. Where is it?
There, you see it there? It's in the middle?
Oh, there it is. Okay, so then here, thank you. I finally found it. Okay, this is the sight line that's going down. This would be the 15-foot height, and that's the sight line. So into my garden, and I have, you remember my living area back there outside. If it was 20 feet, now I've lost where it is again. If it was 20 feet, it would actually end up shooting farther out, so over my house, and not so much into where I live back there. This on the other side, now I've lost it again here. It would be the 12-foot hedge on level ground, so to be 2 feet above my roof line. So if I were fortunate enough to live on level ground and I was fortunate enough to have a 12-foot hedge, I wouldn't have to look at my neighbor, or my neighbor wouldn't be able to see everything I was doing.
I see. So you're asking for 20 feet, and your objective is to create a visual barrier to your backyard. Is that the primary, like when you're
And my
comparing
bedroom,
the
yes.
15 feet?
Yes,
foot-
between 15 and 20, yes,
Okay.
to my living area in the back.
And when we're talking about the length of the side yard, is there a particular portion of that side yard? Is it just in the back that you are, where that additional height is important?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So in the open area beyond my house and in between my
Toward the
garage and my
back?
house.
Yeah, is that-
Yeah, that is where it's most important. However, because of and I know that the light and sound isn't supposed to be important, but our bedrooms are there, and if it was lower, the light there, they have the second story, when it's lit up, lights my bedrooms up as well as my yard. So granted, I could put blackout curtains on the bedroom. So.
I see. Okay, I think those are my questions. Let me just double check. Oh, and when, I mean, at this point, this may just be curiosity. The change in grade from your neighbor to the east when their site was redeveloped, like was that just through the process of creating a level ground?
They took out all
their...
the soil from the subterranean garage and left it on site, so they just raised it. Yeah, so it's level probably from the other side of their property. But it because we're on such a slope, it raised them quite a bit.
I see. So, and then on that eastern edge of their property, are they pretty much even with the property next to them?
They're probably, between 1.5 and 2 feet at the boundary. Because, we're sloping, so we have rise over run, so, it goes along the length of our frontage there.
Right.
But at the boundary, when you change, that's why I call it a tectonic shift, because instead of sloping down like this and then my house sloping down, they just raised it up here, so it was like a plate shifting.
All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Any comments from the staff closing this portion of it?
You still have questions? I think you know.
Oh.
I didn't have a question. I just wanted to make
Oh, do you have a question?
I do have a question for the applicant, yes. So if you could bring up the image of your 4 trees.
Okay, which way? Wait, I think I'm going this way. No. Is that it? No,
back.
It's the other way.
Okay. Is there a bigger one? Is there? Well, that's good.
That's the largest one.
I just want to, before I ask my questions, I just want to ask staff if you're all comfortable with that image, just as that's a fair image of the trees. Is that? They're beautiful trees, but I just want to make sure we're okay because so my understanding is that the ruling said, as it currently stands, you can come down to 12 feet or you can make arrangements above 12 feet such that it would not be a hedge anymore. And if I'm looking at the 4 trees, it's the 2 on the outside that strike me as having the most from this photo, and please correct me, that's what I'm trying to understand. Do you have any ability to prune or trim the trees well above 12 feet to provide more transparency safely? Because the arborist report only addressed cutting them down to 12 feet. This is a de novo hearing. We have lots of options, and I'm wondering whether there are other things you could do with the trees between leaving them alone entirely and bringing them down to 12 feet that you would feel good about with the trees.
I imagine they could be thinned. I wouldn't feel good about it because I know my neighbor to the rear leaves her lights on all night long, and she does that, she says, for security reasons. I've asked her to turn them off. So they're on all night long, and they light up the backyard. And I'm a naturalist. I enjoy the dark. So to have all that illumination is, it could be done.
But how high is your neighbor's
She has a
house?
2-story house. They built it in 2010.
So how many feet up are those lights?
How many feet up are the lights? She used to have them on the palm tree, so they were about maybe 20, maybe 15 feet high. I'm not sure what she has them on now. I know I still see them, but I don't know what she has them on now.
So if you thinned above 20 feet, you wouldn't have an issue
Yeah,
with her
no,
light.
wouldn't
You
have an
wouldn't have a noise
No.
light pollution issue.
That would be
Okay,
fine.
Thank you very much.
Are we done?
Please.
Why did you pick 30 feet as the height to cut back to?
The high tension wires are around that height there. When I don't think I mentioned that when Southern California Edison came through at the end of 2015, they restrung all the high tension wires along that side of the block, and they cut back my trees at that point. So that's why they're where they are now.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any comments or anything you want to add?
No, I don't believe so, unless you have any questions for staff.
Commissioner Perry?
Yeah, I have a question about I guess, at what point does a tree turn into a hedge, or how much separation do you need between something that is really unregulated in height and something that's regulated in height?
Code doesn't specify the amount of separation that has to be between two trees to keep them as separate trees. Part of I think to lead to Commissioner Landers' question, we did offer the suggestion of if you did maybe take down a middle one. I think Commissioner Fresco also suggested that could maybe possibly constitute them now being separated. But it's hard to tell without seeing it.
Mm-hmm. And that's also true of the side yard, right? That if there was space created within the hedge for a fuller size tree, then that could be a way of achieving the appellant's goals.
Possibly, yes. If she maybe removed every other one, then there might be enough separation to then allow them to be considered separate trees and not one continuous hedge, which would then allow an unlimited height limit, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and I mean, let's continue with questions of staff, but after that, I do want to pose a related question to the appellant again, if that's okay.
Okay, why don't we, if you have no other comments and no other questions, let's reopen.
He has another question.
You have a question of? Okay, I need a sense of the motion. We want to reopen the discussion with the appellant. Any objection? Okay, we'll come back to it. Okay, hearing no objection, please, what is the question?
So I wanted to raise this idea. It seems like your goal is very focused in terms of, when we're talking about the side yard now, your goal is very focused on that particular spot between like your garage and your house, that the ability to see into the backyard. Did you consider a different planting plan that may allow you unlimited height in that area? I mean, I know it's a very small planter area.
Oh yeah, it's minute. It shouldn't have those trees probably in it anyway. But that was my only option. A different option. I mean, I would do what you suggested and take out individual plants. There's 12 podocarpus there. I would just take out the ones in between and let them grow to whatever height. Because the one at the I don't know if I'm answering your question, but the one at the very end of the garage actually blocks that master bedroom view into the area that I sit in. So I would want to leave that one there, and so I would rather just have that at whatever height and take out ones intermittently. Was that what you're asking?
So you're saying that if for example the appellant the appeal was denied, then your
That's
plan
what I would do.
Your plan would be to thin out what you currently have planted there along the side yard.
Yeah, I would turn them into trees and not a hedge. Yeah.
And you said that your your plan would be to remove every other one?
Mm-hmm. That can do in the side yard. In the rear setback, it's not doable.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, closing. Wait, do you have another question for? Okay, let's close the public discussion, have one more round with the staff here, and then see where we go.
I'm sorry, I'm leaving this, I should take this off. I don't have any questions. I have lots of things to say.
So I inquired of the city attorney ahead of this meeting as to what our guidelines were in terms of what we could consider and what not relative to trees, and was, if I'm not misstating, was told that we do not, as a planning commission, have as commissioners in this discussion, have the ability to refer to the urban forest master plan as a basis for making a finding. However, is that a fair summary? I was trying to get it down to a sentence.
Yes, the three findings that staff already pointed out don't actually include consideration of other city plans, ordinances, and policies, which is different than, say, a development review permit, which has a specific finding.
Okay. So here's a little bit of where I'm going with this. I'm looking at page 9 of the staff report, where there's a reference to goals of the loose, which I assume was offered in the as a justification for understanding the context in which we're operating, and I certainly appreciate goal N4 of the loose and policy N4.1. What I'm curious about is, if I go to the loose and I look at policy, is this a goal or a policy? This is a goal. S1.6, prepare a community urban forest management plan and update it a minimum of every 10 years to assist with local sequestration of carbon dioxide emissions. And if I look at goal S5.5, is this a goal or a policy? No, that was a policy. And if I go to S5.5, which is also a policy, as part of future updates to the city's green building ordinance, explore a requirement for shade trees on south and west facing sides of all new buildings to reduce building energy loads. This is a question. If we're using the loose to lay the groundwork for a decision, can we not use all of the loose to lay the groundwork for a decision?
So I think that was, we provide that background, but when you look at the findings, whether from the ZA or the staff's recommended findings, none of them have basis in the loose. There's no reference to the loose in the findings. Maybe this was just force of habit. Arguably we probably shouldn't have, have general plan consistency in there. But in terms of the actual findings, the three findings and the only findings that are required for a fence wall hedge modification, there's no reference to general plan consistency or the loose.
Okay. And with respect to, and what about with respect to zoning consistency? The reason that I'm asking this question is that if we look at, do we have an image of the neighboring property?
This isn't my presentation, so I'm not sure where it is. Okay.
Oh. And either presentation is fine. It just, that's good. That's fine. Well, yeah.
I don't know if this
one that shows me the length of the back of the whole house. Yeah, well, no.
Here, no, here.
Yeah,
okay,
it's fine. I think we sort of know it.
I can find it.
I apologize.
That shows the side.
Well,
side a little.
Here's where I'm going, and this is what I want to. Even that is fine.
Right.
What I'm trying to get at is this property could not be built under our current. This structure could not be built under our current ordinance because the second story is not set back, and I'm the interim zoning ordinance. I just looked it up on R1 requires a setback of the second story on the side of it, I believe at least 10 feet. And it strikes me that if the setback were in place on this structure, we might be having a very different conversation about the side hedge, and I'm wondering whether or not we are permitted to take the current ordinance into consideration for our findings. If we're not, we're not, but...
No.
No?
And quite frankly, I couldn't affirm or deny, whether you could do this house under the current code.
Okay.
It exists, it was permitted, that case is completed, so it really has no bearing, relevance, what have you, to, the case before you. The one thing that we did look at in terms of, again, the determination was the difference in grade, and what we try to do when I look at these modification requests is to try and level it out to, if it were a flat property, you could have an 8-foot fence and a 12-foot hedge. And so the determination tries to resolve that grade differential by effectively allowing 12-foot, a compliant hedge on the taller property side, and it's 15 feet on the subject property side. So that was some of the thinking that went into, why 15 feet. It was roughly midpoint to make up that grade differential that would be code compliant, in a flat lot situation, whether it's 1-story or 2-story, because, we can't really consider what the, whether it's 1-story now, the next door is 2-story, or they're both residential uses. In theory, in the future, this subject property could have a 2-story residence as well. That's what setbacks are for in terms of the side and rear, is to address those impacts for light and air and space between buildings.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, we've closed the testimony part. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention to Commissioner Perry, that even if she were to remove every other hedge, for example, they would still need to be pruned, trimmed, maintained, so that they didn't result in, again, crossing over into each other. So it's not just the removal that would only be needed.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Fresco, did you have something you wanted to ask?
Not ask.
Okay.
Speak.
Okay. So thank you. We're now in the deliberation phase. I would like to suggest that we divide the project into two parts, the side yard and the rear yard. And I think we should start just by discussing the side yard. And if anyone wants to make some opening comments, otherwise we'll move toward a motion, and then we'll have our discussion on the side yard.
I would like to, well, I think the side yard is actually pretty straightforward in my thinking, and I could actually make a proposal that we approve. I see an 18-foot high hedge as a really kind of straightforward approach to
Okay, does anyone want to second that?
I'll second that.
Okay.
So do you want me to explain my thinking, or do we want to just go ahead?
Well, we can believe you unless your thinking is particularly Baroque.
Basically, it's we have an 8-foot wall there, which it's a 6-foot grade differential. It's an 8-foot wall. We know that the first floor of that property is roughly 2 feet below that wall. There's, the railing that we don't like, that has had complaints and so forth. So basically that leaves 12 feet is the fair amount of hedge that they would normally have if that were the ground. I feel that splitting the difference isn't really fair, because the higher property has all the advantage of air, light, and privacy, and to make it fair, the lower property should have the same amount of privacy that it feels it needs.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor. It's been seconded. There's been some discussion. Commissioner Perry?
Yeah, I might be able to make the findings for that. I want to ask, would you be open to requiring the 12-foot height in the first half of the property, and then 18 beyond? So the front, the hedge along the first half would have to comply with code, and then beyond that it could go to 18.
Doesn't the hedge begin behind the gate already? Isn't it already behind the front setback?
I'm not talking about the front setback. I'm talking about the first half of the property. So if it's 100 feet deep, then
No, then I don't think that would solve the problems. Why would you suggest that?
because the applicant is saying that her concerns about the impacts of the neighbor next door are in the back half of the property.
Don't you think that would be the wackiest, weirdest looking hedge in the neighborhood? Just in terms of neighborhood character?
No, I don't.
Oh, okay, just
Okay,
saying.
no wackiness allowed. Okay, we've had a motion. It's been seconded. We had a suggestion, which was denied. Are there any other discussions regarding this, the considerations of the side yard?
I think that's an elegant solution to it, and I'm going to vote for it.
Okay. I assume because you seconded it, you don't have any additional comments. Then I would like to call the question for the side yard. All those in favor of an 18-foot high side yard?
I sounds like you're trying to take a straw poll because you have one action here. It's one
Okay.
modification. So
Okay, then we'll just park this for now,
Okay.
And then park
and
it,
and then we'll come back to it.
Take the straw.
Okay, we'll take the
Let's do a
straw
straw
vote.
poll.
Okay, get your straws out. Okay.
My straw is long. Yes.
My marine biodegradable straw is yes.
I'm voting in favour of it.
Yes. Okay. So let's move on to the rear yard.
That sounded like unanimous agreement.
Yeah.
That's very
All right.
exciting.
Yeah. I think we probably, it sounds like we kind of agree on the rear thing too, which is basically that our city talks always about our urban forest and we're always trying to finagle ways to protect trees on private property, and yet when the trees touch each other, suddenly we have a problem. And this is very complicated. I spent an inordinate amount of time on this, considering our very simple short agenda with one item. I looked at a lot of properties on my Google, flying around the city looking at streets without alleys in the rear yards. And they really do have neighborhood characters, notwithstanding what the laws are. And they do fluctuate over time because, as you know, I collect aerial views and maps. Our laws are very unfortunate that they require, something to mitigate in order for the trees to allowed to touch. And I think we need to look really closely at whether or not these trees are really and truly a hedge. And I mean, I know our city law, per the definition of the code, says that they enclose, divide, or protect. I think that we can argue with that word enclose in this particular case. And in other definitions of hedges, it talks about them formed by closely growing bushes that are trimmed and shaped to form walls. It's clearly not formed and shaped to form a wall, and it certainly isn't enclosing or dividing everything, considering that it's really a clump or a cluster rather than a partition I'm arguing this isn't a hedge. I think it's a clump. I call it a fairy circle.
A fairy line.
So, a fairy line.
Okay. Any other considerations before we move toward a motion here, Commissioner Perry?
Well, I don't see it that way.
What do you have? Okay.
It does divide, and it's to me it fits the definition in the code.
Okay.
Commissioner McKinnon and then Commissioner Launders.
So in examining it, the thing that divides these two properties at the back there is that wall. If the wall didn't exist, you'd be able to walk through and walk underneath and walk between. And clearly at the upper levels, these four trees do touch. But I was struck by, at the site and afterwards, that the hedge is cut through willy-nilly and trees are cut in quite different ways. And right through the city of Santa Monica, we have trees that are closely planted that have joined at upper levels. And we celebrate that as we go. There are vast numbers of trees north of Montana and right through Sunset Park. And we're not arguing that they're hedges, we say they provide tree canopy. These particular trees do need pruning, and they probably need to come down from the heights that they're at, and they need more attention. But they are still 4 trees to me, and it doesn't look as though they were planted to act as a hedge or to barrier off the whole of the backyard. They were planted in one particular part. And the point I was driving at earlier on was that when you stand in that backyard, there is no alley, so there's no differential between this backyard and the backyards of the street adjacent to it. Right up and down that backyard dividing between Pearl and the next street, there are these high stands of trees. And it so clearly is a tree, and it's so clearly not what we classically define as a hedge. I will not vote to take down trees in the backyard. That is just not going to happen while I sit here. That is not what we are here to do. And if it requires the immediate updating of the zoning code, then we need to do it. It's just absolutely crazy. But this doesn't even come close to being what would be a hedge.
Commissioner Landers. So
I want to echo Commissioner McKinnon and say, and Commissioner Fresco, I'm struggling to make the finding that this is in fact a hedge. But I respect that at height, which is a part of the issue, that there is some blockage happening that makes it hedge-like in the terms that I think Commissioner Perry was trying to allude to. And I agree that this needs pruning, this needs some work, and it probably does need to come down from the height that it is. But it's a catch-22, because if we don't find that it's a hedge, we can't actually require that stuff be done to it. And given the dilemma at stake, I'm stuck with, because I was able to walk around it and I could see through it, and I couldn't find that it was an enclosure. I'm simply really struggling to make the finding in the first place that it's a hedge.
So I'd like to bring in a little different perspective, if I may, as the chair. First of all, it's pretty clear that on the side yard we had an extenuating condition, this change in height, and that allows us to interpret things when there is an unusual condition to, let's call it, bend the code to fit the unusual condition, essentially using the code to try to level that condition. In this particular case, we don't have a difference in height. We have a perfectly level lot, and there's no reason, there's no exception here that we can get to. So what we're trying to do is balance the letter of the law and the intent of the loose and everything else that we have at our disposal to try to preserve canopy. And so in that head-on conflict, I would say, well, whose ox is being gored? And the ox that's being gored is the neighbor directly behind. The neighbor directly behind said, I'm comfortable with 20 feet. That neighbor has already spoken. So there is no victim here in a sense if we bend the code, because we're trying to preserve biomass, shade, privacy, whatever we want. We don't even get into the definition of a hedge. So what I would like to propose is that there be a 20-foot height limit for that back hedge. And I think that that is a reasonable compromise between the contending, let's say, vectors here that are pushing in different directions. The other thing it would do, it would bring the top of that tree just basically in line with the low voltage wires that always go through on that lower level, so we wouldn't be running into any problems. That would be still clear of those. So I'd like to throw that out as for your consideration. If anyone wants to act on that as a motion, then I'd be very pleased. And let me add one last thing. If these are ficuses are, even though like every tree, they have to be pruned carefully, they are very hardy trees and they spring back, most ficuses.
Well, the thing that I was actually thinking as the owner of a very assertive ficus, several. If you have a 30-foot ficus and you cut 10 feet off of it, you're going to have a 40-foot ficus the next year. So that's a pretty
Okay. Let me add
risky proposition.
Okay. Well, let me add one other thought to this. We already have a neighborhood here, which half of it is non-conforming. So at a certain point, you say, well, is it half full, half empty? In other words, are we already in a situation where this neighborhood has skidded way beyond the zoning code? It's just not, half of the neighborhood is already out of line. Even though respectfully only 3 have applied to be out of line, everybody else is in effect out of line. And the last thing I would like to say is, when discussing these kinds of things, we have to be very careful of setting a precedent. Are we essentially greenlighting everybody to go nuts with their rear yard hedge trees, whatever it is? So there are some conditions that would preclude a precedent being set here. First, the back neighbor, the one who's directly affected, has to agree. And then the second thing is, there has to be 40-year or older trees. In other words, if they have to meet those 2 conditions, then they might be able to use this as a precedent. If they can't meet those 2 conditions, then they shouldn't be allowed to use our precedent. So anyway, I'm putting that out there for your consideration.
I guess I have a question, if I can. I'm looking at our alternative actions, and I don't know whether this applies. What would on the backyard, what would a continuance mean? Is that an option in this instance?
You certainly can. There's not a time limit within which the commission must act on this modification, but it is one application before you, so you would be continuing a decision both on the side yard and the rear yard. You could not bifurcate.
We can't bifurcate
that decision in that way.
Okay.
So can I ask you, Sean, is the intent of the continuance to have 2 other voices speak on the issue, or is there something else that you're looking for?
Well, I'm sensitive to the precedent issue. I'm sensitive to the neighborhood consistency issue. I'm also sensitive to the questions that Commissioner McKinnon raised. That I have similar concerns about. When we look at R1 again, I have concerns about heights, hedge heights relative to large homes and setbacks. I don't feel like I can think through this. It feels risky to think through this on a single project. This project has raised questions for me that I want to explore further. And there is work underway with respect to the city's policies on urban canopy that may, as Commissioner McKinnon raised, may lead to some policy changes with respect to how we think about trees and canopy on private property relative to relative to these heights and issues and whether or not canopy is hedge or not. So I was sort of hoping to. We also, and the last thing is that there are apparently a number of open code compliance issues related to a number of, I'm looking for a neutral word, growths that have not yet been addressed. And so what I wanted to try to get to was if we could resolve the side yard, I wouldn't want to damage the trees before we were able to make a decision that was actually going to be consistent across the neighborhood, which it sounds like we're going to start to hear about if all of those enforcement actions proceed apace. So that's that's what I'm struggling with.
Okay, so you feel a continuance might allow you to resolve those. Okay, thank you, Commissioner Fresco.
These are one-off decisions that are really based on unique conditions, and the reason we have rules about limits for hedges, and the reason when they exceed them, and complaints come in and we take a look at, typically it's not staff going around and sending in 700 different addresses to code compliance and filing them all through. Usually it's triggered by neighbors who have a particular issue. Suddenly they've they have a shade issue or whatever it is. But usually it's a neighbor complaint or something has gone awry, and that's what triggers it. And then we go in and the hedge has exceeded its boundaries or its manners or whatever it is, and then we take action. And, you know, and a hedge is a hedge in that case, and it's a barrier and it's a boundary and it's overstepped itself. And I feel very comfortable in looking at this clump that it is less than a hedge, and that I can say that in this individual case, and that I'm not setting a precedent, and that it is not giving permission for all the other blocks. One of the things that I spent too much time doing this week was looking at all the other blocks without alleys in this little section of Sunset Park between 11th Street and 14th Street. And I made poor hardworking staff members send me PDFs so I could look and see who else had registrations. And I noted that within each block there were, with all of the non-conforming things, and I won't mention any addresses because I don't want anyone to get in trouble, but there were usually about at least half to 2/3 of the rear yards had giant trees in them that were touching, and probably 3 out of those had registrations. And it averaged about the same per block. And what that told me is that's how many people in every block opened their mail in 2007. So, you know, so I think that this is really a case-by-case basis. And in this case, I don't see a hedge that's hurting anybody. I see a clump of trees that probably needs pruning. And as a ficus owner, I have a guy, he has to come every year because that baby gets really crazy. But, you know, it is what it is. So,
Chair, may I just provide a little bit of context to this?
Please.
So, as some of you know or may not know, is the history of fences, walls, and hedges in the city has a very long, somewhat painful history to the staff and the community as well. You know, there were it's been decades of this kind of discussion and the definition of what is a hedge, tree, shrub, and bush, and what have you. These rules have been in place for quite some time, you know, in terms of maximum hedge height and what have you. What has also come with it is interpretations, which is what I'm hearing the commission discuss at this moment in time. I do want to caution that it's what you're talking about is not, although each case is unique and different and we consider it on its own merits, the interpretation you're setting forth, you know, will set precedents as to how the staff is defining a hedge. And historically, you know, the definition of hedge, when you look at the plain reading of the language and when we have code enforcement officers get called out to assess, is that a hedge? And you read the words of, is it a boundary or barrier plant material? Does it divide, protect, or enclose? It's not and, it's an or. You know, it checks all of those boxes in terms of it meeting a hedge. I understand there may be some discomfort with that definition or desire to change it, but from the staff's perspective, and we have had other, you know, situations where we've been asked to interpret this, and it's been very consistent over the years. So I just want to be very careful that, you know, if we make an exception for one, and I can understand all the testimony, you know, that's been put forth tonight, but I do want to caution that how we interpret things really matters, because it affects how we enforce, you know, then, because it's not the people who have good intentions, you know, that we have to be concerned about. It's that, you know, if someone pushes the limits on it, we do have to have very clear rules, and we have to, you know, whether we like it or not, the law is as it's written, and we have to implement that. And if there's again a desire to change that, you know, I would recommend, you know, tabling, you know, maybe suggesting a future discussion or what have you. You know, we don't have on our work program a revision of a fence wall hedge code, you know, at this moment in time, for, you know, I don't think anyone wants to open that up, but I just wanted to provide that
So
context.
let's do a little thought exercise here. Hypothetically, let's say we were uncomfortable with making any decisions for exactly those reasons and all the rest, and we decided to continue it to where a hedge ordinance or tree ordinance could be raised as part of a larger discussion. How long would that take, hypothetically? Could we get to a private tree ordinance of some sort, hedge ordinance, revised hedge ordinance, as part of our ROI? Would that be something we could?
So at this point in time, we've received no such direction from council. I can share with you that an undertaking like that would be a significant amount of staff time, to the detriment of the many priorities that we have going on.
Okay.
So, I really couldn't guarantee as to when something like that would occur.
Well, I guess what I'm asking is, let me ask it from the other side. Is there an enforcement action right now on this particular thing,
There is an open code enforcement case.
Okay. How long can that open enforcement case live before it becomes punitive?
We don't handle the enforcement piece, but
So I can't speak for enforcement, but it's my understanding that generally, so long as the property owner is seeking a remedy, that the code enforcement will take that into consideration. And I also do just want to shortly piggyback on some of the planning manager's comments, and in terms of when administrative decisions like decisions made by this commission or the zoning administrator are challenged in court, there will be great deference given to the city's interpretation of a law, and the court will also look to how consistently that interpretation has been applied over the years. So consistency is extremely important in defending on how decisions are made.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Perry, and then...
Yeah, if the planning manager and deputy city attorney's comments weren't compelling enough, and they definitely should be, the planning commission in the past has required property owners to change hedges that are far less massive than what we're looking at on the screen right now. That right-hand image, you blur that picture a little bit, you have a 30-foot wall. I don't mean wall in the code sense, but just practically speaking, this is one of the larger departures from code that I have seen serving on this commission. And I can, it was described by a commissioner as a balance between, the code and the loose objectives, and it really isn't a balance. This is the code that we are living under. This is the code that it's our job to interpret and implement, and any uncertainty about how good a job the code does can be a discussion for later, but not a continuance for this particular application. And I am going to move as a straw vote that we deny the appeal with respect to the rear wall and uphold the zoning administrator's decision.
You're speaking only about the rear wall now, because we've already changed
That's right.
it on the side. Okay, thank you. Nina, you have your light on. Is that okay?
So I'm just hoping for some clarification, and I understand that we are obliged to follow the code, which is why I think there's a conversation about what the definition is and whether we can make the finding about the definition. I will say that I'm uncomfortable the more I think about it, and this is not for tonight, but Commissioner McKinnon has raised the question of the distinction between a canopy and a hedge. And if we are trying to save tree canopies in one place and prevent hedges at certain heights in others, then that is a dilemma that needs resolution, perhaps above our pay grade. which we will then follow. I have a question so we've been told that we can't bifurcate this appeal. I had, in my ex parte conversation with the appellant, one of the questions that was raised was why this was in fact one action as opposed to two, and I assume it's because it's tied to a single parcel and it was a single code enforcement case that was opened. So there's no ability to separate actions here. Is that there's no option of that? I just want to clarify.
No, it's one application before you for, we often have, modifications for, multiple modifications or requests for multiple modifications on properties, which is why you'll see in the STOA, there's the option, we've added a relatively new thing called like the partial approval. It was a way to clarify some parts are approved, some parts are not, so that we are able to clearly state each part of the decision. And
then with the continuance, I noticed that there's a requirement that there's agreement from the applicant. We've closed the discussion with the applicant, and I don't know if there's a procedure for us to try to understand, given the discussion on the dais, whether there is, because the chair made a recommendation for 20 feet, the Commissioner Perry made a recommendation for 12 feet. There have been some discussions about
neither of those were seconded.
Neither of those were seconded. I'm saying a recommendation.
Yeah, right.
And there was some discussion, I think, from a few of us about pruning. And I guess it would be helpful in this case, in service of an attempt to remain consistent and come up with a code compliant resolution. How would we find out from the applicant what she thinks is viable here, so that we can actually get to a resolution that would, if we were going down the continuance road or some other that involved the agreement of the applicant? I think it's a procedural question. Can we invite her back up?
Well,
I think your rules, just as you did just now, your rules allow you to reopen the hearing and ask that question of the applicant.
Can we invite the appellant back up?
I'd like to offer a thought. So, if we view this as a hedge, Commissioner Perry is absolutely right. It gets cut down to whatever it is, 12 feet. If it's a tree canopy, it's okay. So you have to make up your own mind about that. In my view, it's a tree canopy. That's the way of looking at it. I may be 100% wrong, according to Commissioner Perry. That's okay. We've had those issues before. And that'll happen again, probably. But when I look at it, the way it grew, the way the trees were pruned at the branch, yes, it's formed a tree canopy. I don't see it as a hedge. So under those circumstances, it can be maintained. But if you see it as a hedge, then it has to come down. And that's the way. And that will be the precedent that you set. And when the zoning administrator comes to look at it, they'll have to make a decision about whether it's tree canopy or a hedge in the future.
Okay. Commissioner Perry.
I'm perplexed by this comparison between a hedge and a tree canopy, and that somehow it seems like some of us are looking at it as it's one or the other, and if it's one, we approve, and if it's the other, we don't approve. What are we working off of in the code that says that that's even the question before us?
Well, it's, to my mind, personally, it's a hedge because the trees have grown together. But we're struggling with the biomass issue, and we don't want to be in the business of cutting down trees. I think that's the dilemma we're stuck on, if I'm not mistaken. We don't want to be in the business of removing trees.
Well, on that point, this is why we earn the big bucks, to stay at meetings late and to make decisions that are painful. And no one on this dais, I would expect, very few people in the community would be excited about those trees coming down. My understanding is that these particular trees weren't even a part of the original complaint. So, but that is immaterial to the question that is before us. And I will try to avoid repeating myself, but I feel like there's a responsible path that is rooted in rule of law and established practice. And if we want to if we don't like the way that the code addresses this, we can separately, after deciding this issue, talk about changes to how we treat hedges. As the planning manager, it's a very sensitive subject, but we can certainly have it, but just not in this context.
So, Commissioner Launders?
Yeah, I'm reading this and I'm struggling with it. And I'm trying to get to where Commissioner Perry is going. And I think if we're going to parse definitions, I think we all agree that a person can pass between these. So let's, if I can, let's sort of eliminate that or. And now we have a boundary or barrier of plant material formed by a row or series of shrubs, bushes, trees, or other similar vegetation. I think we can agree that this is a row or series of trees that enclose, divide, or protect an area. I can't make the finding that it encloses or divides, but I have to acknowledge that part of the argument for the preservation that the appellant has made is to protect something from light from somewhere else. It's there that request has been made, and whether it's a boundary or a barrier raises the question of how we're distinguishing between canopy and hedge. So that's why I wanted to hear from the appellant to see whether or not this would, because I agree with Commissioner Fresco that this is not that kind of hedge, and so I'm looking to get to a resolution that doesn't require us to make the declaration that I think if we follow Commissioner Perry's reasoning we would have to make, and then the question is just how high are we permitted to allow that hedge to go. But it would be helpful to me to think through this, to hear from the appellant again about what mitigation steps she can take with respect to that, without characterizing it yet as a finding.
Well, before we go down that road, we're certainly able to go down that road. Is the real contention that these trees, we know they're trees, but they're pretending like they're a hedge, are touching each other? And so the question is, how big of a slot would you need between them? Would you have to prune? So the height issue would disappear, and now you're only dealing with, is the separation adequate to not perform as a hedge? I guess I'm looking to you, Commissioner Perry, see your thinking on that. I mean, an extreme thing would be to take out two of the trees. Now you'd have a clear slot, right, between each tree, no more hedge, a bunch of trees. I'm not want to go into the business of cutting down trees, but I'm certainly willing to go down the business of pruning trees. So is that something that would meet your concerns, and yours too, Richard?
That we would be saying what? What's the action that you're
Well, I'm
proposing?
saying hypothetically, let's say you pruned a slot between these trees, and I'll choose a dimension. The dimension's not important. Let's say it's a 2-foot slot. Now you've taken 4 objects that are acting somewhat like a hedge, and now you've converted it into four trees, and they're just sitting there. They're just not, they're like the fingers of your hand, you know, they're no longer a one-handed mitt, they're a mitt with fingers. Yeah, and I'm asking that is this a viable path that we might be able to go down, meeting the letter of the law, and yet still not killing trees, which is something we're all reluctant to do.
Well, I think that you're getting into an area where the staff's job to do a site visit to assess whether a collection of whatever they are, bushes, trees, or other similar vegetation, is acting as a hedge.
Mm-hmm.
And so here what we're saying is, to what height could a hedge go? That's our job here
Right.
tonight.
Well, right now, the only place a hedge can go is 12 feet. I mean, by any reasoning that we've gotten to, and I'm saying, can we unhedge it? Can we hedge our bets and unhedge it?
I don't follow.
By pruning, separating the trees so they're no longer acting as a hedge, would they?
I think the tool we have is height. That's the tool that we have tonight. That's what we are being asked to consider, is a question of height, and whether they find, the applicant and city staff can find an agreement on something that, some modification where it is no longer acting and fitting the definition of a hedge, then that's something that they can do. But that's not what we're doing right here. We're talking height.
Okay.
Yes, I had a suggestion which I had made to the applicant based on a personal experience, which she had proposed to her arborist, and I had sent it to you guys. Well, I sent it to Kyle. I don't know if, did you forward it to everyone? I don't know. Maybe you didn't understand. Kyle. Basically what, I had a hedge of ficus trees, but of course it was by an alley, so there was no height limit involved. And it was foolishly many feet away from the wall, and I wanted to reclaim my yard, so I planted a new hedge several feet further, closer to the property line. As the new trees were growing in, every year I would crop away limbs from the old trees and reduce them to provide air and light to the new trees, and slowly reduce them and allow the new ones to grow up. So I suggested a 5-year plan like that, where she could reduce boughs from the center trees and allow the outer trees to gain strength and robustness and fill in. And I'm wondering if it's possible to ask somebody to remove a hedge on a 5-year plan. It's basically where I'm going with this, is that...
Well, on the precedent this evening, 20 years is more appropriate.
That's kind of where I'm going. Is that something that would entertain the legalistic minds in the room could entertain?
I mean, I would like to ask staff if we have that authority to require a transition over time to a different standard.
So I think it's helpful just to come back again to the scope of what you're reviewing tonight, which is a hedge and modification for side and rear yard, and a modification to exceed the height limits that are in the code. With respect to, you do not need to provide direction on how someone might be code compliant, because the code is what it is. There is condition number 8 in the STOA that basically already says that it talks about maintenance and trimming of the approved hedge, which in this case, this was talking about the side yard hedge, and all of the hedges on the site shall be maintained and trimmed so they don't exceed the height limits or extend over the adjacent property line, or these hedges shall be pruned so that they are not considered hedges as defined by the Santa Monica Municipal Code. So that's really an all-encompassing condition, is that we don't need to give direction as to how someone might comply. That's, people can do that in any way they need to. Again, your hearing tonight really is, can something exceed the allowable heights that have been established in the code?
I still really want to hear from the appellant. In particular, it strikes me that where you're headed is to allow the possibility that this might be a hedge, and encourage the appellant to get somewhere where it's not a hedge. Turn it right.
Turn it into a tree.
Turn it into a tree. But that if it stays a hedge, I want to come back to what our chair proposed. To me, 12 feet is way too low under the circumstances because it just doesn't work. And I think there are good reasons for it related to the lights from the neighbors. But it sounds like 20 feet would work. And the question that I have about these particular trees is whether if the appellant chose to do nothing but trim them to 20 feet, would they survive? And I know you're saying that, I know, right? You trim a ficus to 20 feet, you get a 40-foot one, but could the appellant live with 20 feet?
Chair, it's not up to us to ask the appellant whether or not they comply. We make the decisions, they comply.
I'm not asking a question. I'm not asking about of course, if we say it's 20 feet, it's 20 feet. I'm asking a question about the we were told in the appeal
it doesn't matter
that 12 feet would kill them. And I believe that there's good reason I believe there's good reason to go above the 12 feet. I'm asking, as a matter of encouraging this not to be a hedge, whether in the process of it unbecoming a hedge would die in the meantime if it's pruned tomorrow to 20 feet. That's the information I'd like to understand.
So,
Richard,
in reviewing all of this, we do not need to accept what the planning administrator put forward as the definition of the hedge. This is a de novo review. We make the decisions here tonight. We rarely do that, but on this occasion we do. We make the definition. Commissioner Parry has said the definition, when he looks at those trees, is that it's a hedge. I'm looking at those trees and I'm saying that's tree canopy. We get to make a decision here tonight about whether that's the case or not, and then the chips fall away from that afterwards. There may be a continuance required because we can't reach a decision here tonight, because it's 3-2 or 4-1 or whatever it is. But we should at least try and make a decision. I agree with Commissioner Parry, that's what we're here for, and we need to keep making decisions and moving forward. The continuance to discuss whether or not at 20 feet it survives or not, that's a different thing. I don't see any reason for that at all. There might be an acceptance of a continuance by the applicant because we can't reach a decision and we want more time. But we are empowered tonight to make a decision about whether or not that's a hedge, and then we're also empowered to make a decision based on the evidence about what the height of the hedge is if it's a hedge. If it's a tree canopy, it just keeps existing.
Okay, let's try to move ahead here. We've had a number of considerations here. Let's start with the easiest one, which I hope is not interpreted as sort of neglecting our responsibilities. I'd like a straw poll here about how many want to continue this or want to try to keep going and reach some sort of decision. Let's just go down the row, straw vote.
Wait, those were two opposite things.
Continue, do a continuance, not reach a decision tonight, or keep going tonight.
Oh, I'm supposed to say which one I want. That wasn't a yes or no.
Yeah.
Oh, I would like to make a decision.
Okay. Decision.
Decision.
Decision. So the continuance is off the table for our purposes. Okay, so now let's go on to, we've had one option, which is to cut it down to 12 feet, follow the rules, okay? For any number of reasons, we've heard the pros and cons of that. Let's just take a straw vote right now. All of those in favor of 12 feet. Perry, Mr. Commissioner Perry, you want to make a...
I can make the findings for that.
Okay. Let's go straw poll here and see where we are. Nina, would you mind weighing in?
No.
I can't make the findings for that.
No.
No. So we're not at 12 feet. Let's keep going. We had a motion to, let's start, to sculpt the hedge, canopy, whatever you want to call it, so that the trees aren't touching anymore, to be determined the difference between them. Like a straw vote, is that a viable alternative? Leave them at their height, just slice them vertically.
Chair?
Yeah.
I really would encourage us right now that if 12 feet doesn't work, then we find a height that does work based on compatibility with the surrounding area. Now, I would argue that that includes not looking at non-registered, non-conforming hedges. Others may have a different take on that, but based on that, I would support 20 feet.
Based on if we were to find what? I'm sorry, what would we?
Compatibility with the neighborhood.
Compatibility with the neighborhood.
Before we do that, I think for clarification, and maybe we already know this, but do we have 4 votes that this is in fact a hedge? Just for clarification, is there agreement that this is in fact a hedge? Could be not.
Okay.
If I may speak to that just a moment. So I think we back up to how this got before you this evening. So a code enforcement officer went out to the property to inspect the side yard and then also inspected the rear yard and made a determination that it was a hedge and that it did not comply with code. So I'm not sure what your interpretation would have in terms of an effect on the code enforcement officer's decision. And if you were to make a determination this evening that no modification was necessary because you didn't feel it was a hedge, I'm not sure what that means for the code enforcement case.
Okay.
Okay. Can I because if I may clarify, and I want to acknowledge this, I agree that there is a problem in the law with the distinction between with the definition of a tree canopy and the definition of a hedge. But I have to acknowledge, having heard the discussion and having thought it through as the discussion was unfolding, it strikes me that our current definition in the code of hedge includes tree canopies. And that's a problem that needs to be addressed yesterday. And we need to find a way to address that. But this case has to be resolved before that gets solved. And so I would ask as much, I'm going to say that I think it is, under the law, it is a hedge. It is a tree canopy and a hedge. Both are true. I would like that not to be the case, but it is. And so can we get to, as Commissioner Perry has asked, to some decision? But with respect to Commissioner Fresco,
So we seem to have 2 ways that might allow this thing to remain somewhat intact. One is the compatibility route. If it's compatible with the prevailing nonconformities of the neighborhood, then we travel with that sort of legal protection. The other way is to slice it into a set of 4 trees, and they can grow as high as they want, but there's okay. So does anyone have a third approach that might be comfortable with?
But what I would say is that Commissioner Parry's approach is an elegant solution because it allows the trees to remain, the tree canopy to remain, described as a hedge to the city, but at 20 feet. The slicing of the trees, that's an unknown. We don't know how that'll turn out, but we do know that the trees at 20 feet, canopy hedge, will survive, and that there is a justification and compatibility, and it satisfies all the requirements of allowing the appeal.
Can I just clarify if I'm hearing correctly that the proposal by Commissioner Perry is compatibility with the ones that are non-conforming, so not just the registered ones, but
it's setting aside it's not for me. It's not based on non-registered, non-conforming examples in the area. It's based on those that are non-conforming registered.
That are registered.
Yes.
That are legally registered.
Right.
Okay.
Which I believe we had one example nearby.
In the rear, 3.
3. I heard that only one of them was a hedge. Only one's a hedge. And what is the height of that? And while
Sorry.
While Ross is looking that up, the question was raised earlier, and I may have missed the answer. Do we have the authority to change the timeline for compliance? For example, could we say that there needs that the maximum height changes over time?
I got it right.
Like in the next year, it needs to be reduced by 2 feet for the next, and so on? Or is it we choose the maximum? We can only choose the maximum height now, and they need to comply within the code enforcement period of time.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't see something in the zoning ordinance that allows that sort of gradual, removal or reduction of it. That would really, how it complies is really within the authority of the code enforcement team, of which, for a variety of reasons, there's no mixing between that and what we do from a zoning perspective. I think that the applicant could certainly work with the code enforcement, to, make those points. But I don't really see a mechanism for us to have that reduced in a gradual way.
And can it be a recommendation to code enforcement from this body? Or a consideration?
Considering their role, which is completely separate, and their discretion has to be completely independent, it might be difficult to do that.
Commissioner Perry, if you move that as a motion, I will second it. And then the rest of the commission, you have, as I suggested a minute ago, an elegant way of moving past this impasse.
Would you clarify exactly what you're suggesting in your findings?
Oh, well, I was asking if there was an option for us to say something to code enforcement about.
No, before that how you got to
motion.
The motion.
I'm sorry,
How he got
the question.
He's saying he's looking at the other registered.
Commissioner Perry was suggesting that 20 feet be the size of the hedge on the back boundary.
And Ross, were you successful in finding the
Yeah, so
current
the
height?
only property that has a registered hedge is 1217, so it's the upper green one, and it was for a 15 to 20 foot tall hedge on the side property. It goes to the rear, but it is not along the rear.
May I? Okay. Because I think we can get to the 20-foot finding without having to look at the non-conforming properties, and that is to look at the fact that there's light from the rear neighbor, and that a 20-foot height would allow the subject property to preserve itself from light. This is not a privacy issue, which we're not allowed to consider, but I do think that light considerations we're not explicitly barred from looking at those, are we?
I think you're looking at that first finding. Again, it is a two-part finding. It's one of compatibility and what you're talking about in terms of mitigating impacts from adjacent land uses. Because that wasn't a recommendation of the zoning administrator's original determination, I would certainly encourage that the commission articulate the basis for the approval of the rear hedge clearly within the findings that are required.
So for me, the basis would be that second aspect of finding one, and it sounds like we do have some consistency, that we do all agree that this would be consistent with current conditions generally. Somewhere between 50 to 75% of these of properties in the neighborhood are non-conforming, registered or not. So I'll second that motion too. Heck, I'll make it 20 feet.
Okay, do we have any additional discussion or considerations that might change that?
Is there a second for 20 feet?
Well, I think it was already
Yeah,
in
I'll
your...
second your motion.
In your motion.
Or make your, yeah, I'll second that.
I thought Richard had already seconded it, but yeah. Okay. Third it. Okay, so any additional discussion? Going once.
And I don't know if this is what you were referring to, Commissioner McKinnon, but I will put forward the idea that without asking code enforcement to handle it in any way that they consider inappropriate and in keeping with their mission, but that they consider the health of the trees when establishing the timeline for compliance.
Okay, so we have a modification, let's say, to the ordinance that the health of the trees should be
Conditions, not ordinance.
No, it's just part of the approval. It's part of the motion. And I guess right now we're just in a straw vote anyways.
Right.
But
would it be, I guess I don't know when we would do side recommendations, but I think we do need to address this tree canopy versus we need to register somehow separately from the STOA, register our concern about the tree canopy versus hedge discussion and the question of hedges and large homes.
I think that can be carried over. Okay, so let's start with the straw poll. We seem to be having a direction here before we take a formal vote.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, then we will take a formal vote. And the let's say the motion is, do you want to say it clearly, Commissioner Perry, so it becomes part of the record? You had some specific wording you'd like to include in that.
And it's the full motion.
Yeah,
both
so
parts.
we're both the side yard.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
so so technically is this technically approving the appeal? Or is it denying the appeal?
It's a partial approval.
So you, because you are, I believe actually you're suggesting something that was originally requested, so it's a denial of the appeal but a partial approval, I think is the appropriate action.
Okay, so denial of the appeal and partial approval with the side yard at 18 feet maximum height and the rear yard at 20 feet maximum height, and with the request, along with all the other verbiage, the request that code enforcement consider the health of the trees in establishing the code compliance timeline.
I'll second that. Just for clarification, will the STOA include this? You had it in the original special conditions. At the end it says, or these other hedges shall be pruned so that they are not considered hedges as defined in SMMC section, et cetera. So will that go in the standard STOA for both the side and the rear yard, so it's clear that if the appellant wants to make some changes to the material there, they can?
Yes, that's
Okay.
the standard. We would adjust that to reflect the partial approval.
Great.
So it's just standard language in there.
Thank you.
Okay, so, and I think you should state in your motion, if I may, make a recommendation that it's based on the compatibility with the other hedges in the neighborhood that may or may not be conforming.
Based on our ability to make the findings. Yes.
Okay, all those in favor?
Wait, it's a roll call vote.
Yeah, it's a roll call. Commissioner Fresco?
Yes.
Commissioner Landris?
Yes.
Commissioner McKinnon?
Yes.
Commissioner Perry?
Yes.
Chair Fonda?
Yes. Okay, so let me put it this way. It's not very elegant when you see how the salami is made, but I think we came out with a pretty good one for everybody. So let's move on to the last part of our agenda here. I guess you'll bring back the STOA for this to us for approval?
Yes, we will.
Okay. Okay. Any written communications? We have none. Future agenda items. Somewhere out in the future, we have a discussion about hedges versus canopies versus trees that this has pointed out. That would be a future agenda item. Any other future agenda items? Okay. Any public input on things that are not?
I just had this thought that when our fine director gives his report with all of our millions of meetings coming up in the future, maybe a little slide with all those dates and just the highlights, because I'm always writing frantically and I always miss half of them, and then I'm, you know, trying to remember to get them in my calendar when I get home, and the dates are always changing. It would be cool. Thank you.
Okay. Right. So any public input on items that are not on the agenda? And I'd like to have a motion to adjourn. Okay. Anybody seconded? I see. Forgot.